My name is Daniel Reyes, and I'm 32 years old. This happened one fateful autumn weekend in Sedona, Arizona, a trip meant to offer respite from the relentless pressures of my modern life. My partner, Emily Harper, and I decided to embark on an RV camping journey deep into the mystical landscapes of the Red Rocks, seeking both adventure and a break from our routine. I was the practical one, always determined to find logical explanations, while Emily, with her intuitive sensitivity, often trusted her gut. Little did we know, our trip would plunge us into a nightmare that defied both reason and belief. We set off early on a cool Friday morning, our RV loaded with supplies and an eager hope that the serene beauty of Sedona would soothe our weary souls. Our destination was a remote campsite near ancient Navajo sites, a place reputed for its spiritual vortexes and legends passed down through generations. Despite our excitement, the RV itself had seen better days, a few mechanical quirks and some electrical issues that we hoped wouldn't rear their heads. I spent the first part of the journey double-checking the engine and wiring, while Emily admired the vibrant landscape rolling by, her eyes alight with a mix of wonder and quiet apprehension. As we drove deeper into the back roads of Sedona, the red rock formations towered over us, casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. We found our campsite nestled in a secluded valley, bordered by rugged trails and dotted with ancient petroglyphs. The site, though picturesque, felt oddly isolated, almost as if it were set apart from time itself. That first night, after settling into our temporary home on wheels, a subtle unease began to creep in. I remember sitting on the RV's small porch, sipping coffee, when I first heard it, a soft murmur carried by the wind. It wasn't a sound I recognized, more like a whisper of voices, barely discernible, as if the rocks themselves were speaking in an ancient tongue. I dismissed it as the wind rustling through the rock formations, but Emily's eyes told a different story. She stared into the darkness with an intensity that conveyed both fear and an inexplicable recognition. The following morning brought minor setbacks. Our RV's heater, which had been acting up the previous night, finally gave out completely in the chill of early dawn. I fumbled with the controls, but nothing worked, leaving us with a biting cold as we prepared our breakfast. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, not just because of the equipment troubles, but also due to our clashing perspectives. I insisted that every anomaly had a logical explanation, while Emily, ever sensitive to energies and omens, urged caution. Our differing approaches created an undercurrent of stress that would only intensify as the weekend unfolded. Determined not to let these setbacks ruin our adventure, we set out on a hike to explore the nearby petroglyph sites. The trail wound its way up a steep incline, and I couldn't help but feel that we were trespassing into a realm where ancient legends still held sway. Emily led the way, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if searching for something unseen. About halfway up, we noticed an unusual phenomenon. Animal tracks that were far too large and oddly shaped, scattered along the trail. I brushed them off as the handiwork of a local predator, but Emily's unease grew. "Something isn't right," she murmured, her voice trembling as she knelt down to examine the prints. That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, we returned to the RV. The atmosphere had grown thick with tension, and the earlier whispers had transformed into a chorus of unsettling sounds. I heard the distant howl of a coyote, its cry resonating with a timbre that sent shivers down my spine. And then there were the lights. Flickering, inexplicable lights danced along the rock faces, moving with a purpose that defied natural explanation. The RV's interior, already cramped and claustrophobic, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Inside the RV, objects began to move on their own. I'd placed my camera on the dashboard the previous night, only to find it moved to a different spot when I awoke. Emily was visibly disturbed. She claimed to have seen a fleeting shadow near the window, one that resembled a cloaked figure moving among the petroglyphs. Her description matched stories she'd heard of skinwalkers, malevolent shapeshifters from Navajo legend known to haunt these lands. Our growing fear compelled us to seek answers. The next morning, we drove to a small town on the outskirts of Sedona to consult with a local Navajo elder reputed to have deep knowledge of the land's spiritual history. The elder, a weathered man with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom, listened intently to our account. In a measured tone, he explained that we were not merely encountering stray phenomena, but had attracted the attention of a skinwalker, a cursed being that could shift its form to mimic those it hunted. He warned us that such entities are not mere passive hauntings. They are dangerous, violent, and hungry for the life force of those who dare trespass in their domain. The elder offered us a small pouch filled with protective talismans and recited a chant in a language that resonated with the cadence of ancient winds. "These will help, if only for a time," he cautioned, his voice heavy with sorrow and forewarning. Emily clutched the pouch tightly, and I nodded, though I felt little comfort from these rituals. Skepticism warred with the desperation in my mind. However, as dusk fell that evening, every logical explanation seemed to crumble in the face of mounting dread. That night, the atmosphere turned almost unbearably oppressive. The sky was a deep, inky black, and the only light came from the flickering embers of our dying campfire. I sat beside Emily in the dim glow, both of us too silent to speak, lost in our own turbulent thoughts. Then, out of the silence came a sound, a low, guttural mimicry of my own voice, distorted and chilling. I froze, my blood running cold. Emily's hand shot out to grab mine, and together we peered into the darkness. The figure appeared gradually, a silhouette that moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form shifting between that of a man and something far more monstrous. The skinwalker had come. I could hardly believe what I was witnessing. This was no mere ghost or trick of the light, but a being that actively stalked us. It circled the campsite, its eyes glinting with a predatory intelligence. The protective talismans lay scattered on the ground as if disrupted by an unseen force. Panic surged through me as I scrambled for the elder's pouch, reciting the chant he had taught us. The words felt hollow against the relentless presence of the skinwalker, whose mocking movements seemed to defy our desperate defenses. Emily, driven by an instinct that transcended fear, began to arrange the talismans in a protective circle around the RV. I joined her, though each passing moment only deepened my sense of impending doom. The skinwalker attacked with a ferocity that shattered the fragile barrier we had erected. It lunged at the RV, its limbs contorting in unnatural angles, claws scraping against metal. The struggle was fierce and chaotic, an otherworldly battle between ancient malevolence and our fragile human resolve. In the ensuing melee, as we fumbled with the protective charms and shouted the elder's incantations, the entity proved to be relentless. At one point, I swear I heard it whisper my name in a voice that was both mine and not mine, a cruel imitation that sent shockwaves of terror through my soul. In the midst of the chaos, tragedy struck. Emily, ever the heart of our makeshift defense, took a blow meant for both of us. I watched in horror as she collapsed, blood pooling around her. The skinwalker's attack had been savage and unforgiving, and despite our desperate efforts, nothing could stop the onslaught. In that instant, the RV, our sanctuary turned prison, echoed with a silence more chilling than any scream. Time seemed to slow as I cradled Emily in my arms, her life fading with every passing second. I begged the ancient forces to grant her solace, even as the skinwalker hovered nearby, its presence a relentless reminder of our vulnerability. Her eyes, once filled with hope and empathy, now stared blankly into a void that no incantation could reach. The pain of her loss was indescribable, a raw, searing agony that tore through me, leaving me numb and disoriented. In the aftermath, the skinwalker did not vanish immediately. It lingered, its malevolent gaze fixed on me, as if to savor the sorrow it had wrought. The creature's violent energy was palpable, a dark force that had taken nothing but had given me only grief and despair. Every shadow seemed to mock my helplessness, every rustling leaf a reminder of the horror I had witnessed. Desperation eventually overcame my shock. With a fractured heart, I gathered what little strength remained and forced myself out of the RV. The desert night was cold and unforgiving, but I had to escape. I stumbled along the rocky path, every step a battle against the encroaching darkness and the omnipresent dread of the skinwalker's pursuit. The protective talismans that had once seemed so promising lay forgotten on the ground, mere trinkets against an ancient curse. I ran blindly through the rugged terrain, guided only by the faint light of a crescent moon and the distant, haunting call of a coyote. The world around me was a blur, a landscape painted with fear and stained with sorrow. At times, I could almost hear Emily's voice urging me to keep going, even as the overwhelming grief threatened to crush me under its weight. Hours later, when the first pale hints of dawn began to break over the horizon, I found myself at a small, deserted road. The ordeal had robbed me of all sense of time, and I wasn't sure if I was still under the skinwalker's influence or if the creature had simply vanished into the desert shadows. My heart pounded in my ears as I flagged down a passing car, barely managing to convey the terror that had beset us. The driver, a stoic local, merely nodded with a knowing sadness in his eyes and said, "You should have listened to the elders." His words stung, a bitter acknowledgement that ancient warnings were not to be ignored. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to piece together the shattered remnants of my life. Emily's death haunted me relentlessly, each memory of her gentle laughter and determined spirit a piercing reminder of what I had lost. I found myself tormented by dreams where the skinwalker's mocking visage would appear, and waking moments filled with the inexplicable sensation of being watched. I became a reluctant storyteller, recounting my experiences to anyone who would listen, a warning to those who might be tempted to venture too deeply into lands where ancient curses still held sway. In quiet moments, I revisited the local Navajo elders' words and the rituals we had attempted. Despite my skepticism, I realized that there was a power in the old ways, a power that I had foolishly dismissed until it was too late. The protective chants and talismans had been our only line of defense against a force that defied the natural order, a force that had claimed Emily's life with brutal finality. Every now and then, as I drive the lonely roads of Arizona, I catch a glimpse of something. A flicker of movement in the peripheral vision, a whisper in the wind that sounds eerily like Emily's voice, or a set of animal tracks that are inexplicably out of place. These small signs serve as reminders that the supernatural is never truly gone. The skinwalker, or whatever malevolent force it truly was, may have retreated that night, but its presence lingers in the red rocks and the barren desert, waiting for another unwary soul to disturb its domain. I now live with the constant tension between what can be explained and what defies logic. Every rock formation, every shadow under the vast Arizona sky carries with it the weight of ancient legends and personal loss. My days are filled with the mundane struggles of survival and a gnawing fear that one day I might once again encounter that relentless, violent presence. But I also know that I must live, if only to honor Emily's memory and to warn others of the dangers that lie hidden in the darkness. In sharing my story, I hope to instill a sense of caution and respect for the mysteries that linger in these lands. The red rocks of Sedona are not merely picturesque formations. They are silent witnesses to centuries of history, magic, and sorrow. My experience is a testament to the fragility of human life in the face of forces beyond our comprehension. The skinwalker was not a mere specter, but a violent embodiment of an ancient curse, a reminder that the past is never truly dead, and that some legends should be left undisturbed. As I continue to travel these roads, I carry with me the scars of that fateful weekend. The memory of Emily's gentle smile and the echo of her last whispered words serve as both a comfort and a curse. I've learned that survival in this world sometimes means accepting that there are forces we cannot control, and that sometimes the only way to honor those we've lost is to live with the fear, the guilt, and the unyielding mystery that remains. I don't know if the skinwalker will ever return, or if other supernatural horrors lurk in the shadows of our modern world. But every time I drive past a red rock formation, I am reminded of the day I came face to face with an ancient evil, a day that changed everything. And so, with each sunrise over the rugged Arizona landscape, I carry on, a reluctant survivor of a horror that still haunts my every step. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I am forever marked by the horrors of that fateful weekend. I share my story not only as a warning, but as a plea. Heed the ancient voices, respect the old legends, and never underestimate the power of a world that has existed long before us, and will endure long after we are gone. My name is Mia Thompson, and I'm 28 years old. This happened one chilly autumn weekend in the Petrified Forest National Park near Holbrook, Arizona. A trip I took desperately to escape the suffocating memories of a loss that had haunted me for months. I needed solitude, a place where the ancient stillness of petrified wood and barren desert could somehow absorb the grief that had become my constant companion. As an aspiring writer, I hoped that the weathered landscape would not only provide refuge but also inspire me to confront the darkness within. I loaded my aging RV with the essentials: a few boxes of my favorite books, a battered journal, and supplies that I'd carefully gathered over the past weeks. The RV had been my faithful companion for many such trips, though lately it had begun showing its age. Engine misfires, a heater that sputtered in the cold, and electrical glitches that made me uneasy. But the promise of the park's timeless beauty pushed those worries aside as I left behind the city and drove towards a remote campsite on the edge of the park. The journey was long and lonesome, the road stretching out in a ribbon of asphalt beneath an endless sky. I found solace in the rhythmic hum of the engine, even as the RV's occasional coughs reminded me of its frailty. The landscape transformed gradually, from bustling highways to desolate stretches of desert punctuated by clusters of ancient, weathered trees. When I finally arrived at the campground, the silence was almost palpable. The site lay at the very edge of the park, with a scattering of petrified logs and towering rock formations looming in the distance, their surfaces etched with the memory of millennia. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was unnervingly still, and the usual chorus of desert wildlife was muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I unpacked my belongings and began exploring the grounds, trying to distract myself from the persistent echo of my own thoughts. That's when I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin, half hidden by a copse of dead junipers and surrounded by clusters of petrified wood. The cabin's exterior was weather-beaten, its once bright paint now faded and peeling, but it exuded a strange magnetism that I found impossible to ignore. Inside the cabin, dust motes danced in shafts of weak sunlight. My heart quickened as I discovered a dusty, leather-bound diary resting on a rickety table. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with spidery handwriting that detailed the thoughts of a previous camper. The entries were cryptic, filled with fragmented observations of strange occurrences and personal despair. I couldn't help but feel that the diary, with its haunting reflections and unanswered questions, mirrored the turmoil inside me. That evening, as dusk swallowed the landscape, I settled into my RV with the diary clutched in my hands. The RV's heater had finally given out, leaving the small space shivering in the cool desert air. I turned on the radio hoping for some comforting music or chatter, but instead I was met with a channel full of static. Then, as if emerging from the crackle, a voice, distorted and somber, began to read passages that eerily echoed the diary's entries. The voice was low and measured, each word laden with a sorrow that made my skin crawl. I listened in disbelief as the radio repeated fragments of the diary, as though the cabin's long-forgotten owner was reaching out from beyond. Sleep proved elusive that night. Every rustle of wind against the RV, every creak of metal, seemed magnified in the oppressive darkness. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the door, half expecting to see a shadow flitting past. My mind, already rife with memories of past traumas, began to blur the line between reality and nightmare. I scribbled notes in my journal, trying to capture the disquieting feeling that something was watching me from the periphery of my vision. The next morning, I awoke with a heavy sense of dread and a nagging question. What was the connection between the diary's tragic account and the strange occurrences I'd experienced? Determined to find answers, I decided to explore the cabin further. With the diary tucked under my arm, I ventured back into the eerie silence of the overgrown path that led to the forgotten dwelling. The interior of the cabin revealed more clues, a few scattered personal items, faded photographs, and a small rusted key that I found tucked inside a crevice in the wall. Each discovery deepened the mystery, stirring both my curiosity and my fear. Unable to shake the feeling that the cabin's secrets were beyond my solitary grasp, I sought out help from a local historian known for his knowledge of the park's legends. I drove into Holbrook, where the dusty streets and quiet storefronts spoke of a community that had long adapted to the harsh rhythms of the desert. I found the historian, Mr. Alvarez, in a small museum dedicated to the region's history. His lined face and thoughtful eyes gave him an air of quiet wisdom, and I hoped he could provide some context to the unsettling narrative I'd uncovered. Mr. Alvarez listened intently as I recounted my experiences, from the eerie radio broadcast to the discovery of the diary and the strange artifacts in the cabin. He leaned forward, his voice soft, yet filled with a gravity that sent chills down my spine. He explained that decades ago a young camper had vanished under mysterious circumstances in that very part of the park. According to local lore, the camper had been tormented by the harshness of the land and by visions of something inexplicable. An echo of a presence that seemed to inhabit the ancient petrified logs and desolate expanses. Many in the community believed that the park held a kind of lingering sorrow, a remnant of past tragedies that could manifest in the form of apparitions or unexplained phenomena. Armed with this new knowledge, I returned to my campsite with a mixture of dread and determination. I spent the afternoon rereading the diary, each page now imbued with a new significance. The words seemed to pulse with a hidden energy, as if they were the record of a soul trying desperately to break free from its confines. At the same time, I began to notice subtle signs around me, footprints in the dust that led nowhere, the occasional whisper of my name on the wind, and the persistent sensation that I was not alone. Night fell again, and with it, the oppressive weight of isolation. The radio's static returned, and once more the disembodied voice recited lines from the diary. This time, however, the words were interlaced with the desperate pleas and cryptic warnings. I felt compelled to respond, speaking softly into the still air as if trying to bridge the gap between worlds. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling in the quiet of the night. The only answer was the whisper of the wind and a fleeting glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that vanished before I could focus on it. Sleep became a distant memory as the night wore on. I was haunted by vivid dreams, where the abandoned cabin reappeared in a kaleidoscope of disjointed images. I saw myself walking through its corridors, encountering the ghost of the lost camper, whose eyes were filled with sorrow and longing. In these dreams, the diary's pages fluttered open on their own, each entry a painful reminder of regret and unfulfilled promises. I awoke several times, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, unable to shake the feeling that the past was clawing its way into my present. At dawn, a fragile light broke through the horizon, and I reluctantly set about trying to salvage what I could from the night's terror. The RV's engine coughed weakly as I attempted to start it, echoing the mechanical troubles that had plagued me since the journey began. Frustration and exhaustion warred within me, but I knew that I couldn't remain trapped in this haunted purgatory forever. I decided to document everything, every strange sound, every inexplicable occurrence, in hopes that my words might someday serve as a testament to the mysteries of the park. In the quiet hours before noon, as I reviewed my scribbled notes and the diary's cryptic passages, I began to suspect that the supernatural events were not entirely separate from my own inner turmoil. The recurring themes of loss, regret, and unspoken longing that filled the diary resonated with the memories I had long tried to bury. Could it be that the park was simply a mirror reflecting the wounds of those who ventured into its depths? Or was there something more sinister at play, a malevolent force that fed on sorrow and used it as a conduit to manifest in our world? Determined to find clarity, I resolved to return to the cabin one last time. With the rusted key clutched tightly in my hand, I made my way back along the overgrown path, the desert around me bathed in an eerie, pre-dusk glow. The cabin loomed before me like a relic from a forgotten time, its silence both inviting and foreboding. Inside, I retraced my steps, carefully examining every corner, every object that might offer a clue. I found a sealed envelope tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were several photographs of the vanished camper, alongside a letter written in a hurried scrawl. The letter spoke of overwhelming loneliness and an inexplicable attraction to the petrified forest, a place where the boundaries between life and death seemed to blur. It ended with a desperate plea. If you find this, remember that the echoes of the past can offer redemption, or they can drag you into oblivion. The weight of those words pressed upon me, and I felt as though I were standing at a crossroads between confronting my own grief and succumbing to the overwhelming pull of the park's ancient sorrow. Back in my RV, I sat for hours, contemplating the meaning of the letter and the possibility that my presence here was not a mere coincidence. Perhaps, like the lost camper, I was drawn to this place to face the ghosts of my past, both literal and metaphorical. As twilight descended once more, I resumed my vigil by the RV window. The desert around me was dark and silent, save for the soft murmur of the wind and the occasional rustle of dried leaves. I listened intently, half expecting the radio to burst into life with another spectral broadcast. And then it happened. The voice returned, this time softer and laden with an almost gentle sorrow. It spoke of forgiveness, of letting go of the pain that tethered it to this lonely place. In that moment, I felt a profound connection to the unknown speaker, as if the lost camper's spirit was finally reaching out to guide me towards healing. But the sense of calm was short-lived. As I attempted to process this new revelation, a sudden chill swept through the RV. The lights flickered, and in the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a figure standing in the doorway of the cabin, a fleeting, translucent silhouette that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner here than anywhere else. The park was a repository of memories, pain, and unresolved sorrow, and tonight it seemed ready to share its secrets. In that charged silence, I whispered, "I forgive you. I forgive myself." Whether it was the wind, the spirit of the lost camper, or my own desperate need for absolution, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The oppressive weight of isolation began to lift, replaced by a fragile hope that I might finally be able to let go of the grief that had consumed me. The RV's heater remained broken, and the engine still coughed intermittently, but in that moment I realized that some things, like the scars of the past, could only be healed through acceptance. The night passed in a haze of mixed emotions. I spent hours writing in my journal, documenting every detail, every whisper of the supernatural that had intertwined with my personal journey. I wrote about the diary, the photographs, the letter, and the eerie radio broadcasts that seemed to act as a bridge between realms. I recorded my dreams and my fears, pouring my heart onto the paper in a desperate bid to reclaim my own narrative. By the time dawn broke again, I felt a cautious resolve stirring within me. The petrified forest, with all its ancient mysteries and unyielding silence, had shown me that the past, both mine and that of those who had vanished here, could be faced and perhaps even healed. I knew that I could no longer run from my memories or allow them to dictate the course of my future. With a deep breath, I started the RV, its engine sputtering to life as if acknowledging the transformation within me. I left the campsite with a heavy heart, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. The journey back to civilization was quiet, filled with long stretches of reflective silence. I often caught myself glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a spectral figure following me, a final reminder of the night's revelations. Yet, as the familiar outlines of the highway appeared on the horizon, I felt a tentative peace settle over me. In the weeks that followed, I dedicated myself to writing, a raw, unfiltered account of my time in the petrified forest. My story became a tapestry of the tangible and the intangible, weaving together the threads of personal loss, ancient sorrow, and the inexplicable mysteries of a land where time seemed to stand still. I visited local archives, spoke with other residents who had experienced the park's haunting allure, and even returned to the museum to thank Mr. Alvarez for his guidance. His words and the wisdom of those who had come before me echoed in my mind as I worked to transform my pain into something that might help others. Today, I still drive that old RV on long, winding roads across the desert, the memories of that autumn weekend forever etched into my soul. The broken heater and the sputtering engine serve as reminders of both my vulnerability and my resilience. Every time I pass through the petrified Forest National Park, I feel a quiet kinship with the land, a connection born of shared sorrow and the slow, painful process of healing. I have learned that the supernatural is not always a force to fear. Sometimes, it is simply the echo of our innermost truths, reverberating through the corridors of time. I share my story now not as a cautionary tale of haunted places or inexplicable phenomena, but as a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The echoes of the past, be they voices from an old radio, whispered words from a forgotten diary, or the silent presence of a lost soul, are reminders that we are never truly alone. We carry our histories with us, and sometimes by confronting the darkness within, we can find the light that guides us forward. My name is Mia Thompson, and I am still a wanderer, one who has learned to embrace the fragile beauty of both the seen and the unseen. The petrified shadows, with all their secrets and sorrows, taught me that healing is not a destination but a journey that often leads us back to ourselves, even in the most desolate corners of the world. And so, as I continue down these long, lonely roads, I carry with me not only the scars of my past, but also the quiet promise of redemption. In the silent watch of the desert night, I know that every whispered breeze, every shifting shadow, is a call to remember, to forgive, and ultimately to live. My name is Jamie Reyes. I'm 35 years old, and this all happened one unforgettable autumn when my closest friends and I set out for what we hoped would be a rejuvenating adventure in the rugged expanses of northern Arizona. We loaded my old, rattling RV with supplies and high hopes and headed for the Kaibab National Forest, a sprawling, majestic wilderness adjacent to Navajo tribal lands. I always craved isolation and a taste of the wild, and this trip promised just that. A break from the noise of urban life and a chance to reconnect with nature. From the very start, the journey was laced with a mix of excitement and an undercurrent of tension. I had invited 3 companions along for the ride. Alex Monroe, the group's resident skeptic with a quick wit and an eye for logic. Taylor Brooks, a sensitive artist whose intuitive grasp of beauty was matched only by her deep-seated sensitivity to the unspoken and mysterious. And Chris Delgado, whose anxiety and superstitious nature often put him at odds with our collective optimism. Despite our differences, we believed that our varied perspectives would make for an enriching adventure. As we wound our way through narrow, winding roads flanked by towering pines and red rock formations, the RV began to show its age. The engine coughed and sputtered intermittently, and our outdated navigation system led us down a few questionable detours. Still, we pressed on, laughing off the occasional mechanical hiccup and bickering over which route would be most scenic. Yet, even in those light-hearted moments, an unspoken worry simmered beneath the surface. A premonition that our equipment's unreliability was only the beginning of our troubles. We finally arrived at our destination in the early evening. The forest was both breathtaking and eerily silent, the twilight casting long, stretched shadows across the red dust of the trails. We parked the RV in a clearing that promised seclusion and the raw beauty of nature at its most unspoiled. Setting up camp, we couldn't help but marvel at the expansive view of the wilderness, unaware that we had already crossed into a domain steeped in ancient lore and dark secrets. That first night, as we gathered around a modest campfire, Taylor pointed out a series of peculiar footprints etched in the soft dirt near our camp. They were unnaturally elongated, far too large and oddly contorted for any animal we knew. "What do you make of these?" she asked, softly, almost as if afraid to disturb the silence. Chris's face turned pale, and he murmured something about the local legends his grandmother used to recount. Tales of the skinwalker, a creature rooted in Navajo folklore. Alex chuckled dismissively. "You mean that bedtime story? There's no such thing as a shape-shifting beast, Chris," he said, his tone laced with skepticism. But even his laugh faltered as a distant, eerie howl drifted through the trees, a sound that wasn't entirely animalistic, too human in its timbre. Over the following days, the strange occurrences escalated. We found more inexplicable signs. Broken branches arranged in odd patterns, disembodied voices that seemed to whisper our names on the wind, and shadowy figures flitting just beyond the reach of our campfire's glow. I tried to maintain a leadership role, urging us to investigate these mysteries rationally. But the creeping dread that settled over us was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, we decided to venture further into the forest in search of better viewpoints for Taylor's photography and to capture the untouched beauty of the land for our travel blog. However, our mood soured as the RV began to act up again, stalling on a narrow rocky path. While I fumbled with the engine under the relentless glare of the desert sun, Chris's anxious murmurs filled the air, his eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. "This isn't right," he kept saying. "We're not alone here." Reluctantly, we resumed our journey on foot, dragging along the heavy burden of both our gear and our unease. As dusk fell, we came upon an isolated trail that wound through a thicket of twisted junipers and cacti. The landscape seemed to shift, the air growing inexplicably colder as night approached. It was then that Taylor, ever the sensitive soul, stopped dead in her tracks. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing at a dark silhouette moving just at the edge of our lantern light. It was too tall, too fluid in its movements, an unnatural presence that made my skin crawl. Before we could deliberate further, we encountered a Navajo guide on a narrow trail, a solitary figure draped in traditional attire. His weathered face was etched with lines of both wisdom and sorrow. He introduced himself as Ben, and his eyes carried a grave intensity. "You have come to sacred land," he said in a measured tone, "and I must warn you, disturbing these lands invites the wrath of ancient forces. You must respect the old ways, or you will find yourselves hunted by the Ye-Naald Lushi." His words, laced with a gravity that silenced our skeptical banter, sent chills down our spines. Despite my inner resistance to superstition, I couldn't help but feel that Ben's warning was not mere folklore. We listened as he described the skinwalker, a malevolent being said to be capable of transforming from human to animal and back again. The guide's voice grew somber as he recounted stories of past wanderers who had encountered this dark force, their lives marred by inexplicable violence and despair. That night, as we returned to our camp, the air was heavy with a sense of impending doom. Our campfire flickered feebly against the encroaching darkness, casting uncertain shadows on the surrounding trees. The silence was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. Alex, ever the jester, tried to lighten the mood with sarcastic remarks, but his laughter died away as a new sound emerged, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate from deep within the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to investigate, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the swaying silhouettes of ancient pines and the ever-present haze of red dust. Yet, in the distance, I caught sight of movement, an indistinct figure that lurked at the periphery of my vision. It moved with a predatory grace, its form shifting between that of a man and a beast. I swallowed hard, the reality of the skinwalker's legend now undeniable. Back at camp, panic began to ripple through our group. Chris was visibly trembling, his earlier warnings now a grim premonition. Taylor's sensitive eyes brimmed with unshed tears as she clutched her sketchbook, desperate to capture what she felt but couldn't fully articulate. Alex, for all his skepticism, was uncharacteristically quiet, his usual quips replaced by a haunted expression. I knew that despite our differences, we were united by a shared terror that none of us could easily dismiss. As the night deepened, the supernatural presence grew bolder. Our RV, already unreliable, began to malfunction once more, its engine sputtering as if struggling against an unseen force. Tools went missing from our cramped storage, and eerie symbols were scrawled on the metal exterior of the RV, symbols I later recognized as having roots in Native American protective rituals. The realization struck me hard. We were not alone. Something was deliberately trying to break our resolve. In a moment of desperation, we decided to return to the clearing where we had first met Ben, hoping that the Navajo guide could provide further protection or guidance. The journey back was harrowing. The forest, which had once seemed a benign retreat, now loomed as a labyrinth of dread. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl, amplified our sense of isolation and vulnerability. During the trek, our group's tensions boiled over. Alex's incessant rationalizations clashed with Chris's mounting panic. "It's just the wind, Alex," Chris pleaded, his eyes wide with terror. "You have to believe that something isn't right." Taylor, caught in the middle, tried to mediate, but her soft-spoken reassurances did little to stem the rising tide of fear. I, as the self-appointed leader, found myself torn between logical analysis and an instinctive need to heed the ancient warnings we'd been given. We finally reached the spot where Ben had been waiting. The guide's hut was a modest structure, nestled among sagebrush and guarded by totems etched with protective symbols. Ben was waiting for us, his expression grave. "I feared you would return," he said quietly. "The land is angry, and you have disturbed its balance." Ben performed a protective ritual that night, a ceremony involving the burning of sage and the chanting of ancient prayers. As he worked, I couldn't help but notice the intensity in his eyes, a mix of reverence and fear. The flames of the sage burned with an almost otherworldly light, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as if the very air vibrated with unseen power. But the ritual provided little comfort. The following nights were marked by relentless terror. The skinwalker, or whatever dark force had been stalking us, grew increasingly aggressive. One moonless night, it attacked. We were asleep in the cramped quarters of the RV when a blood-curdling scream jolted us awake. Chris was the first to react, grabbing a heavy flashlight and bolting out into the night. I followed, my heart in my throat, while Alex and Taylor huddled behind the RV in trembling silence. In the inky darkness, I saw it, a creature that defied description. Half human, half beast, it moved with an eerie fluidity, its eyes burning with a malevolence that seemed to pierce the soul. In the chaos that ensued, the creature lunged at us. I managed to grab Chris just as the creature's claws raked across his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground in agony. The pain in his eyes was matched only by the terror of knowing that we were facing a supernatural force that defied all rational explanation. I fought back with everything I had, swinging a heavy metal tool, while Alex, normally so dismissive of such tales, scrambled to help. Taylor, her hands shaking, tried to shield Chris, calling out desperate prayers that seemed to echo off the trees. The struggle was desperate and raw, a violent confrontation in which every heartbeat could be our last. The creature's attack was ferocious and seemingly unending. At one point, it retreated into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving us gasping and bleeding under the indifferent stars. Chris, despite his injuries, managed to pull himself up, his voice a hoarse whisper, "It wants us. It's hunting us." That moment of clarity crystallized our resolve. We could no longer hope that reason or technology would save us. Instead, we turned to the old wisdom of the land. Ben urged us to perform one final desperate ritual, one that might either appease the ancient force or drive it away. With trembling hands and hearts pounding with fear and determination, we gathered around the small fire at Ben's hut as he instructed us. We recited the protective prayers he taught us, our voices rising in unison against the oppressive silence of the night. The air grew charged, and for a moment, I believed we might have succeeded. The wind howled as if in protest, and the shadows seemed to recoil. But the reprieve was short-lived. The creature returned, more violent than before, its furious eyes fixed on us. In a final desperate stand, I hurled myself at it, my only thought to distract it long enough for the others to escape. The ensuing struggle was a blur of chaos and pain, a cacophony of shattering glass, wild screams, and the unyielding determination to survive. I don't remember much after that. There was the searing pain, then silence, and eventually, the bitter taste of defeat. When I awoke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the pines. The creature was gone, but the toll of the night's terror was etched into every one of us. Chris's injury was severe, and the RV lay in ruins, its engine forever silenced by the unknown force that had attacked. In the aftermath, as we huddled together in a makeshift shelter near Ben's hut, we were forced to confront the reality of our ordeal. The skinwalker, this shape-shifting harbinger of ancient anger, had proven itself to be not merely a spectral presence but a violent and deadly force. The experience had stripped away any illusions of invincibility, replacing them with a raw understanding of our vulnerability in the face of nature's dark, inexplicable powers. Alex, whose skepticism had once been our shield against fear, was visibly shaken, his usual quips replaced by a somber silence. Taylor's eyes, once filled with creative wonder, now shimmered with a mixture of grief and lingering terror. And Chris, still fighting pain and shock, could only whisper words of warning, urging us never to underestimate the old stories and the forces they represented. Over the following days, we remained in that desolate part of the forest, slowly recovering from our ordeal. Ben stayed with us, guiding us through traditional healing rituals and offering words of solace drawn from his deep connection to the land. Every night, the forest seemed to whisper secrets of ancient curses and forgotten histories, reminders of the delicate balance between man and nature. Eventually, we managed to repair what little we could of the RV and planned our return to civilization. The road back was somber and quiet, each mile echoing with memories of that relentless night. I often find myself haunted by the creature's eyes and the echoes of those desperate prayers. The wilderness, once a symbol of freedom and adventure, had revealed its darker side, a realm where ancient evils still roamed and the past was never truly dead. Now, as I sit in the relative comfort of my home, I cannot forget the lessons learned in the red dust of northern Arizona. Our journey was meant to be an escape, a moment of bonding with nature and each other. Instead, it became a stark confrontation with the forces that dwell in the shadows of the earth. Forces that are both real and merciless. The skinwalker, a manifestation of centuries-old folklore, was not a mere specter but a living nightmare that had taken its toll in blood and terror. I tell my story not as a tale of defeat, but as a warning. There are places in this world where the lines between myth and reality blur, where ancient traditions and modern life collide with catastrophic results. The forest holds its secrets tightly, and some things are better left undisturbed. In that remote corner of Arizona, we learned the hard way that survival is not guaranteed, and that the cost of disturbing the old ways can be far higher than we ever imagined. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the haunting howls and see the shifting shadows that once chased us through the night. The wilderness remains a powerful reminder of nature's untamed spirit, a force that, when provoked, can unleash horrors beyond human understanding. And as I continue my life, I carry with me a deep, abiding respect for the ancient lands and the secrets they keep hidden beneath the red dust. The memory of that night, of our desperate fight against the unimaginable, serves as both a scar and a lesson. In every whispered wind and every creaking branch, I hear echoes of the past, a constant reminder that some evils are as old as the earth itself, and that survival in the wild sometimes means confronting more than just the physical challenges of nature. It means facing the very essence of the unknown, where myth and reality are intertwined, and where the price of ignorance is measured in fear, pain, and the relentless pursuit of survival. And so, my friends, if you ever find yourself drawn to the wild, to the haunting beauty of places like Kaibab National Forest, remember our tale. Respect the old legends. Heed the warnings of those who have walked the ancient paths, and always be prepared for the possibility that in the deep silence of the wilderness, something may be watching, waiting for the right moment to remind you that the past is never truly gone, and that some mysteries are best left undisturbed. My name is Mason Carter. I'm 42 years old, and this all happened one sweltering summer when I decided to leave behind the relentless noise of the city and the crushing weight of personal tragedy. I'd lost someone dear to me, a loss that shattered my world and left me adrift in sorrow. In a desperate search for solace and inspiration, I bought an old RV and set out for the barren, mysterious beauty of northern Arizona, determined to document the raw desolation of the desert near the Painted Desert and the outskirts of Grand Canyon National Park. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt slicing through an ever-changing landscape. I was alone with my thoughts and a deep, persistent ache that I had hoped the solitude would soothe. The RV, a clunky relic of a bygone era, groaned and rattled as I drove along narrow desert highways. Its interior was cramped and smelled faintly of oil and dust, but it provided me with a semblance of home on wheels. I had meticulously planned every detail of this trip, not just as a journey of physical distance, but as an expedition into the depths of my own grief. After days of driving under a merciless sun, the RV finally pulled into a remote clearing on the edge of a ghostly mining town. The town, long abandoned, stood as a silent monument to a forgotten era, its faded wooden signs creaking in the wind and rusted mining equipment scattered like relics from another world. The heat was oppressive, yet the silence was almost palpable, a quiet that seemed to whisper secrets of the past. I set up camp on the outskirts of the town, hoping that this forsaken place might hold the key to understanding my inner turmoil. My first day was spent exploring the ruins, camera and notebook in hand. Amidst the crumbling structures, I discovered remnants of lives long extinguished. There were faded photographs, broken trinkets, and cryptic symbols etched into the walls of old stone buildings. In one dilapidated cabin, hidden beneath a pile of dusty papers, I found a battered leather-bound diary. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but the ink was still legible. The diary belonged to a former cult member who had once lived in this forsaken town, a man who had written feverishly about ancient desert spirits, forbidden rituals, and the promise of salvation in exchange for an unthinkable sacrifice. That night, as I sat alone in the RV with the diary open on my lap, I felt an unsettling chill despite the desert's heat. The diary's entries were a tangled web of hope and despair, recounting rituals meant to summon a mysterious spirit said to dwell in the depths of the barren landscape. According to the writings, the spirit promised transcendence and relief from unbearable pain, but only if the practitioner was willing to sacrifice what they held most dear. I couldn't shake the feeling that the diary's words were echoing the void that had swallowed my heart. The following morning, I set out to explore further. I drove along cracked roads that cut through vast expanses of red earth and towering rock formations, the desert sun casting long, ominous shadows. The isolation was profound, and every mile deepened the sense that I was venturing not only into the wilderness but also into a realm where time itself had lost meaning. As the dusk began to settle, I parked the RV near a cluster of jagged rock outcroppings that glowed eerily in the fading light. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd. While checking my old CB radio, a relic I'd kept more for nostalgia than utility, I began to hear strange static. At first, it was nothing more than a few stray words, but as the night deepened, the static morphed into what unmistakably sounded like the soft, rhythmic cadence of an incantation. I strained to catch every word, but it all seemed distorted and fragmented, as if spoken by a distant, unseen choir. I dismissed it initially as a malfunction of my aging equipment, but the sound wouldn't leave me. Then, on my walk back to the RV, I caught sight of a flicker of movement out in the darkness. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a mirage conjured by exhaustion and the weight of my grief. But as I rounded a jagged outcrop, I saw it clearly, a dim, spectral figure drifting just beyond the reach of my lantern's glow. The figure was barely distinguishable from the shifting desert sands, but it exuded an unsettling presence, as if it were both part of the landscape and apart from it. My heart pounded as I hurried back to the RV. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me. But the diary's passages, with their vivid descriptions of a spirit that demanded sacrifice, haunted my every thought. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake in the stifling darkness, the only sounds the RV's creaks and the soft rustling of the desert wind. Every so often the radio would crackle to life, reciting fragments of the ritualistic prayers from the diary. I couldn't tell if it was real or simply the product of a tortured mind. Over the next few days, the surreal events grew increasingly frequent. The once deserted mining town seemed to come alive in subtle, inexplicable ways. I would find the diary open on a new page each morning, as if someone, or something, had been turning its pages during the night. The radio continued to emit strange, distorted recitations at odd hours, and there were moments when I could swear I saw figures moving among the ruins, their shadows dancing in the corners of my vision. The line between my inner turmoil and the external, supernatural occurrences began to blur, leaving me questioning what was real and what was the manifestation of my own guilt and grief. Desperation nudged me to revisit the diary, to search for clues that might help me understand the nature of these disturbances. The entries grew darker as I read on, detailing a series of rituals performed by a cult that had once worshipped an ancient desert spirit. The cult's followers believed that the spirit was both a guardian and a harbinger, a being that could offer salvation by absorbing the weight of one's sorrow, but at the cost of something irreplaceable. The writings hinted that the ritual required a deep personal sacrifice, and I couldn't help but wonder if my own despair had inadvertently opened a door to this malevolent force. One sultry evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of crimson and purple, I decided to venture deeper into the deserted town. Clutching the diary and my camera, I walked along dusty streets lined with empty, crumbling buildings. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on gravel. In a narrow alleyway, I came upon a structure that looked like it might have been the epicenter of the cult's activities. The building was modest, almost unassuming, yet its interior was filled with strange symbols carved into the walls and floor. In the center of the room lay a circle of scorched earth, remnants of a ritual fire that had long since died out. As I knelt to examine the symbols, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotions, a mixture of terror, sorrow, and a strange magnetic pull. It was as if the very air around me vibrated with the echoes of past rituals. In that moment, I realized that I was not just an observer. I had become part of the narrative. The diary's warnings seemed to insist that the spirit could sense the pain in my soul, feeding on my despair and drawing nearer with every unhealed wound. That night, back at the RV, the supernatural presence made itself impossible to ignore. The radio, which had been silent for hours, suddenly burst into a series of clear, deliberate words. Surrender, let go, become whole. I froze, the words sending chills down my spine. I could no longer deny the possibility that the ancient spirit was reaching out to me, seeking to claim the sacrifice it demanded. Sleep became a distant memory. Each restless night I was haunted by vivid dreams in which I stood in the center of that scorched circle, surrounded by faceless figures chanting in a language older than time. In these dreams, the spirit manifested as a shifting mass of sand and shadow, its eyes glinting with an eerie, unearthly light. I awoke drenched in sweat, the echoes of its voice lingering in the silence of the RV. With each passing day, the distinction between my internal anguish and the external horrors blurred further. I began to document every strange occurrence in meticulous detail. The diary's passages, the inexplicable radio messages, the spectral figures at the edge of my vision. All of it coalesced into a tapestry of dread that I could neither escape nor fully understand. I realized that the ancient desert spirit was not a passive observer, but a malevolent force that fed on the vulnerabilities of the human heart. It was dangerous not only because it could twist reality, but because it preyed on the deepest, darkest corners of my soul. One stifling night, driven by a mix of desperation and determination, I decided to attempt a counter-ritual. I pored over the diary's faded entries until I uncovered a series of instructions that promised to either banish the spirit or bind it away from a person's essence. The ritual required a gathering of elements: a piece of obsidian from a shattered mirror, water from a desert spring, and a lock of hair that symbolized a cherished bond. With trembling hands, I collected what I could find. The mirror shard was hidden in an old toolbox in the RV. The water I managed to scavenge from a dried-up creek bed, and I reluctantly cut a small lock of my own hair, feeling as if I were severing a part of my identity. That night, under a sky ablaze with stars, I set up the makeshift ritual in the center of the abandoned mining town's sacred circle. I drew the symbols on the scorched earth with the obsidian shard, laid the water carefully in a shallow dish, and placed the lock of hair in the center. My hands shook as I recited the archaic verses from the diary, my voice echoing in the still night air. At first, nothing happened, only the relentless silence and the distant rustle of the desert wind. Then, as if in response, the temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with a palpable presence. From the darkness emerged the ancient spirit in its full, terrifying manifestation. It was not a singular form, but a shifting, amorphous mass of sand, shadow, and spectral light. Its eyes, if one could call them that, glowed with a malevolent intelligence that pierced through the fabric of my soul. The spirit's voice, low and resonant, filled the space between us. Your pain is my portal. Surrender and be made whole. I felt the weight of my loss and guilt intensify, as though the spirit were magnifying every hidden sorrow. In that climactic moment, I faced a choice that seemed both inevitable and impossible. Surrender to the overwhelming despair that had haunted me for so long, or fight back and reclaim the fragments of my identity that remained shattered. The words of the diary echoed in my mind. This was the moment of reckoning, the final test of whether I could overcome the shadows of my past or be consumed by them. With every ounce of willpower I could muster, I refused to yield. I continued the counter-ritual, my voice growing stronger as I recited the ancient prayers with renewed conviction. The spirit's form convulsed as if in pain, the desert wind howling around us in protest. For a long, agonizing minute, Time seemed to stand still as the forces of despair and hope clashed in a silent battle. I felt as if I were teetering on the brink of oblivion, my soul stretched thin between surrender and defiance. Then, as if some unseen force had tipped the balance, the spirit's chaotic presence began to recede. The temperature slowly climbed back to its oppressive norm, and the unnatural sounds on the radio faded into the background noise of the desert night. I collapsed to my knees, exhausted and trembling, yet filled with a tentative sense of relief. The ritual, or whatever it had unleashed, was over, or so I hoped. In the days that followed, the mining town returned to its silent, desolate state. The strange phenomena gradually subsided, leaving behind only echoes of that harrowing night. I remained in the area for a few more days, meticulously recording my experiences and trying to make sense of the ordeal. The diary had been my guide into this nightmare, and now it sat closed on the dusty table of the RV, a somber reminder of the fine line between salvation and damnation. As I prepared to leave the desert behind and head back to the city, I couldn't help but feel that I had been irrevocably changed by the experience. The ancient desert spirit had not vanished entirely. It lingered in the corners of my mind, a silent, persistent reminder of the night I faced the darkness both outside and within myself. I wasn't sure if I had truly banished it or merely bound it away for a time, but I had taken the first tentative step toward reclaiming my identity. Driving away from the abandoned town, the vast, unyielding landscape stretched out before me, as desolate and beautiful as ever. I carried with me a deep, abiding respect for the ancient forces that governed this land, and a newfound understanding that sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought within one's own soul. My journey had been one of self-discovery, of confronting the guilt and despair that had long haunted me, and of daring to hope for redemption, even in a place as merciless and mysterious as the desert. Now, as I continue my life back in the bustling chaos of modernity, I often close my eyes and recall that starlit night, the weight of the ritual, and the echo of the spirit's voice. I share my story not as a tale of defeat, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of ancient. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 40 years old, and this happened in early fall deep within the Kaibab National Forest of northern Arizona. I left behind a past full of regret and guilt, a past where every mistake echoed like a haunting refrain in my mind, in search of redemption and clarity. I traded the ceaseless clamor of the city for an old RV and a solitary journey into the wild, hoping that the vast, indifferent forest might help me face the demons I'd long tried to bury. Packing up my aging RV was both an act of defiance and a desperate plea for change. I loaded it with a few essential supplies, some personal mementos that I wasn't ready to discard, and a well-worn journal that had seen better days. As I drove along the winding highways of northern Arizona, the landscape slowly transformed from urban sprawl to endless expanses of rugged beauty. The crisp air of early fall hinted at both the promise of renewal and the quiet melancholy of fading light. Every mile put between me and my past felt like a step toward an uncertain but hopeful future. When I finally arrived at the secluded RV campsite, nestled deep within the Kaibab National Forest, I was struck by the silence and majesty of the place. Towering pines loomed overhead, their needles whispering ancient secrets in the wind, and the rolling hills in the distance promised both solitude and introspection. I parked the RV on a flat clearing and took a deep breath of the cool, pine-scented air. Here, I thought, I can rebuild, bit by bit. I spent the first few hours setting up camp with a deliberate calm. I arranged my few belongings, fixed a small campfire pit, and even took a moment to jot down my initial thoughts in the journal. Each action felt like a small reclaiming of control over my life, a life that had been out of balance for far too long. That very night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was swallowed by twilight, I began to notice things that defied simple explanation. It started with small, inexplicable details. A series of faint reflections on the window of my RV, as if some unseen force was casting delicate, shifting shapes onto the glass. The wind, too, seemed to carry whispers, a soft murmur that, if listened to closely, formed words in the language older than time. As I lay in bed, trying to sleep despite the unsettling sensations, I caught sight of something even stranger. Outside, on a large rock near the edge of my camp, there were markings etched into the surface. They weren't made by any tool I recognized. Instead, they looked almost ritualistic, carved with a precision that sent a shiver down my spine. I could almost feel the weight of ancient Native American legends in those symbols, tales of transformation and rebirth that hinted at secrets buried deep within the earth. The next morning, determined to understand these strange omens, I decided to take a walk along one of the nearby trails. The forest was bathed in the gentle light of dawn, and for a brief moment it felt like nature itself was extending a fragile welcome. As I ambled along a narrow path, the crunch of leaves underfoot was my only companion, until I encountered him. A solitary hiker stood in a small clearing. His appearance was unremarkable at first, a man in worn outdoor gear with a weathered face and eyes that held a quiet, hidden wisdom. I paused, uncertain whether to greet him or continue on my solitary path. He smiled, though there was an enigmatic sadness behind that smile, and beckoned me over with a slow, deliberate gesture. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft yet imbued with a mysterious cadence that resonated with the rustling leaves around us. I nodded, unsure what to make of this encounter. He introduced himself only in vague terms, offering me cryptic advice rather than answers. "If you're seeking to heal, then you must find the sacred clearing," he said. "There, among the ancient totems and beneath the watchful eyes of the forest, nature will help you see the path to forgiveness." Before I could ask any further questions, the hiker tipped his hat, gave a final knowing nod, and walked away as silently as he had appeared. I stood there for several long minutes trying to process his words. Who was he, and how did he know of my inner turmoil? And what exactly was this sacred clearing he spoke of? The encounter left me with more questions than answers, but it also sparked a quiet determination to follow the signs, however cryptic they might be. Back at my RV that evening, the strange omens of the day and the hiker's enigmatic words swirled together in my mind. I settled into the worn leather chair by the small window, my journal open before me. Under the soft glow of a kerosene lamp, I began to write, letting my thoughts spill onto the paper like a long-held secret finally finding voice. I wrote about the burdens of my past, the relationships I'd failed to nurture, the mistakes that had cost me dearly, and the profound loneliness that had haunted me for years. Each word was a painful confession, but also a step toward understanding and forgiveness. The RV, which I had initially seen merely as a temporary refuge, had transformed into a sacred space, a silent confidant where I could confront the darkest corners of my soul. Outside, the forest seemed to listen. The wind carried the faintest echoes of whispers, as if the ancient trees themselves were offering their quiet counsel. I couldn't help but wonder if these subtle signs were meant for me alone. A personal reminder that sometimes the journey toward healing is marked by mysteries and omens. As darkness deepened and the temperature dropped, I found it increasingly difficult to ignore the eerie sensations that had begun to plague me. I lay in bed, listening to the rhythmic beating of my own heart, when an unsettling sound roused me from slumber, a low, mournful weeping that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but as the sound grew clearer, I realized that it was too deliberate, too sorrowful to be merely a trick of nature. I sat up, pulling a tattered blanket around me, and listened intently. The sound transformed into fleeting visions. Images of a woman whose face was shrouded in tears, her features blurred by a mist that seemed to blend with the darkness. Whether she was real or a figment of my troubled mind, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that her presence filled the room with a palpable sadness, as if she were a specter of loss from my past. For hours I remained awake, caught between waking terror and the disorienting pull of dreams. In those moments, the boundaries between reality and hallucination blurred, and the RV transformed into a liminal space where the past and present collided. I recognized parts of her face, glimpses of the love I had lost, of opportunities squandered and words left unsaid. The visions forced me to confront memories I had long tried to suppress, each tear of the spectral woman mirroring the silent grief buried deep within me. The following morning, after a night of torment and introspection, I resolved to follow the hiker's advice. I packed a small day pack with essentials, a bottle of water, my journal, and a light snack, and set off along a path that I hoped would lead me to the mysterious sacred clearing. The forest was awash in the soft light of dawn, and every step felt like a deliberate journey toward redemption. As I navigated the winding trails, I began to notice more of the strange symbols I had seen on the rock near my camp. They appeared here and there on tree trunks and boulders, etched deeply into the bark, as though nature itself was marking a path. The symbols seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, guiding me deeper into the heart of the forest. The journey was arduous, both physically and emotionally. Every step was a reminder of the weight of my past and the need to overcome it. The isolation of the forest forced me to confront my inner dialogue, the persistent, unyielding voice of regret that had haunted me for so long. Yet, as I continued, I began to feel a gradual shift. The oppressive burden of guilt started to lift, replaced by a quiet resolve. The forest, with all its silent majesty and hidden mysteries, was becoming a mirror to my soul. After hours of trekking, I finally reached a secluded clearing. It was unlike any other part of the forest I had seen. Here, ancient totems stood silently in a circle, their weathered faces and intricate carvings speaking of rites long forgotten. The clearing was bathed in an ethereal glow, an interplay of light and shadow that lent the space a sacred, almost otherworldly quality. Standing in the heart of the clearing, I felt as though I had stepped into a timeless sanctuary. The air was heavy with unspoken truths, and every sound, from the distant call of a hawk to the rustling of leaves, seemed charged with meaning. In that moment, as I looked at the ancient totems and the symbols that adorned the natural rock formations, I experienced a profound epiphany. The spectral visions from the previous night returned, but this time they carried a message rather than despair. The ghostly image of the tearful woman appeared once more, but now her eyes were not filled with sorrow, they shone with forgiveness and understanding. In that silent communion, I realized that the woman was not merely a memory of loss, but a manifestation of my own need to forgive myself. Every regret, every missed opportunity, every whispered apology that I had left unspoken was laid bare before me. The sacred clearing became a crucible where the burdens of my past were confronted. I knelt among the totems, feeling the rough texture of ancient wood under my fingers, and let the silence envelop me. In that stillness, I began to speak aloud, to apologize to the parts of myself I had long neglected, to the people I had hurt, and to the life I had once taken for granted. The forest, as if in silent response, rustled its leaves in a gentle, comforting murmur. I felt the weight of guilt begin to lift, replaced by a tentative hope that healing was possible. It was a cathartic moment, one that demanded honesty and vulnerability. The visions, the symbols, the very presence of the forest itself had led me here, to a point where the past and present merged, where I could finally see that forgiveness was not something granted by others, but a gift I needed to give myself. As the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, I felt as though a new chapter was unfolding, a chapter defined not by regret, but by the promise of renewal. After spending what felt like an eternity in that sacred clearing, I knew it was time to return to my RV. The journey back was less burdened, as if the forest itself had lightened my steps. I retraced the path marked by the ancient symbols, each step affirming my newfound resolve. The totems and the quiet murmur of nature accompanied me like silent witnesses to my transformation. Returning to the RV, I found that the oppressive loneliness that had once filled its cramped interior had been replaced by a calm acceptance. I sat down at my small makeshift desk, opened my journal, and began to write a detailed account of my journey. A narrative of loss, confrontation, and ultimately redemption. I knew that my story, though deeply personal, might serve as a quiet beacon of hope for anyone who felt lost in the labyrinth of their own regrets. In the weeks that followed, I continued to travel through the Kaibab National Forest, each day weaving together the lessons I had learned in that sacred clearing. I took long drives along the winding roads, stopping occasionally to gaze at the vast expanses of pine and rock that stretched out before me. Every time I looked at the forest, I was reminded of that fateful day and the power of nature to reveal truths hidden beneath layers of guilt and sorrow. I began to share my experience through my writing and eventually in small local gatherings. I spoke of the enigmatic hiker whose cryptic advice had set me on this path, the subtle omens that nudged me toward self-reflection, and the haunting visions that ultimately led me to forgive myself. Each retelling felt like an act of liberation, a way to spread a message of hope and the possibility of transformation, even in the face of profound personal loss. As I drove away from the Kaibab National Forest on the last day of my retreat, I looked back one final time at the quiet clearing, where ancient totems still stood like silent guardians of wisdom. I knew that the journey was far from over. Life would continue to throw challenges my way, but I had discovered a strength within me that I had never known existed. In that secluded corner of northern Arizona, I had not only confronted the ghosts of my past, but had also found a way to step into a future where forgiveness, understanding, and self-compassion paved the way for new beginnings. Now, whenever I find myself alone on a long open road or quietly nestled in an RV under a canopy of stars, I remember the sacred clearing and the gentle voice of the forest that whispered, "You are enough. You are forgiven." And in those moments, I carry with me the quiet conviction that even the deepest wounds can mend, and that the wilderness holds within it the power to heal even the most shattered of hearts. This journey into the heart of the forest, into the depths of my own soul, has taught me that redemption is not an external destination. It is a state of being, cultivated in moments of honesty, reflection, and courage. My solitary road continues, now illuminated by the soft light of hope and the enduring lessons of the wild. A reminder that sometimes the greatest journey is the one that leads us back to ourselves. And so, as I sit here writing these words in my journal by the fading light of another autumn evening, I know that the forest's ancient magic still lingers, whispering through the pines and etched into the stones. I have learned that even in the midst of isolation, there is a profound beauty in confronting one's inner demons and emerging with a clearer, more compassionate understanding of who we are. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 40 years old, and this journey, marked by strange omens, mysterious encounters, and a sacred clearing bathed in the light of redemption, has forever changed me. My name is Ava Thompson. I'm 35 years old. This happened one late summer when I decided to escape the clamor of urban life and the heartache of a recent breakup by taking my aging RV deep into northern Arizona. I craved solitude, a place where I could finally face the ghosts of my past and maybe, just maybe, mend the broken pieces of my heart. I had always found solace in the vast, open spaces of the desert. The Apache Sitgreaves National Forest promised me a landscape where the wind whispered secrets among ancient rock formations and hidden canyons. I had read about a secluded canyon near some old petroglyph sites, a place where legends spoke of a ghost child, a spirit born from tragedy. I wasn't one to believe in fairy tales, but after months of feeling lost and broken, I was willing to listen to any story that might help me find closure. I set off from the city with nothing more than a duffel bag, a battered journal, and my hopes of escaping the memories that clung to me like shadows. The RV I drove was a relic of a bygone era, its faded paint and creaking frame a constant reminder of its age. The engine coughed and spluttered along the way, testing my patience as much as it tested my resolve. I had planned to reach the hidden canyon by dusk, but the unforgiving desert roads and the RV's intermittent mechanical issues slowed my progress. Every time the engine faltered, I pulled over to check the worn-out dashboard, my heart sinking with each passing mile. I was alone on these remote highways, and each break in the monotony of the journey felt like a small, personal battle against fate. Yet, with every setback, my determination only grew stronger. I reminded myself that this was more than an escape. It was a pilgrimage, a journey into the depths of my soul. After several hours of tense driving and anxious repairs, I finally arrived at the RV campsite on the outskirts of the canyon. The site was remote, a scatter of weathered tents and a few parked RVs set against the backdrop of towering pines and rugged rock faces. I parked my RV on a small clearing where the horizon melted into a tapestry of reds and oranges, the sky ablaze with the promise of another day. Even as I set up my meager camp, I couldn't shake a feeling of being watched, an almost imperceptible presence that seemed to linger at the edges of my vision. That first night, as darkness fell and the desert cooled, I lit a small campfire outside the RV. The flames danced in the cool breeze, their flickering light casting long, wavering shadows on the ground. I sat on a rickety log, my journal open on my lap, and tried to lose myself in writing. But then, in the silence of the night, I heard it, a faint, distant giggle, soft and sorrowful, like the echo of a child's laughter carried on the wind. I paused, straining to listen, but the sound dissipated as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind, yet a chill crept up my spine. The next morning, I woke early, determined to explore the nearby canyon and the ancient petroglyphs that had drawn me here. The desert was bathed in soft golden light, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to be enchanted by its beauty. I loaded a small backpack with water, snacks, and my camera, and set out on the narrow, winding trail that led toward the canyon. The further I ventured, the more I noticed subtle anomalies. There were odd markings in the sand, small, circular imprints that did not belong to any animal tracks I recognized. The petroglyphs on the canyon walls were magnificent, depicting figures and symbols that told stories of ancient peoples and lost traditions. But intermingled with these images were strange, almost modern carvings that looked out of place, as if they were etched by trembling hands in recent times. As I examined the rock formations, my mind drifted to the local legends I had read about. In a dusty, run-down service station a few miles from the campsite, I had encountered an elderly man who spoke of a ghost child, a spirit born from tragedy, doomed to wander the canyon in search of closure. He had looked me in the eyes with a mixture of pity and warning, telling me that the child's sorrow was a mirror for those burdened by grief. I'd brushed it off as an old tale, but now, amidst these ancient symbols, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more truth to it than I'd imagined. While I was lost in thought, a soft sound reached my ears, a gentle humming, almost like a lullaby sung by a distant voice. It was faint, but unmistakable. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing on the rocky ground, until I reached a small alcove shielded from the harsh sunlight. There, in the half-light of morning, I caught a glimpse of a pale, fleeting figure, a little child, translucent and ethereal, standing at the edge of the canyon. The child's eyes were large and sorrowful, and for a moment I felt a wave of inexplicable empathy and loss. I blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving me with a lingering sense of longing and melancholy. Shaken, I retreated back to my RV to collect my thoughts. In the quiet isolation of my temporary home, I pored over my journal, trying to piece together the puzzle of my emotions and the eerie experiences of the day. My mind was a tangle of memories, old wounds from my childhood, the mystery of a sibling lost to time, and the lingering pain of recent heartbreak. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost child was more than just a figment of my imagination. It was a reflection of something buried deep within me. That afternoon, determined to understand what I was experiencing, I made my way back to the small, abandoned service station on the outskirts of the forest. The building was weathered and forgotten, its windows clouded with dust. Inside, I found remnants of a past era, faded advertisements, broken chairs, and a counter that bore the scars of time. It was here that I encountered the elderly local again. His name was Elias, a weathered man with eyes as deep and knowing as the desert itself. He sat in a corner, his gnarled hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. When I mentioned the ghost child I'd seen, his eyes narrowed, and he beckoned me closer. In a hushed, gravelly voice, Elias told me the legend in full detail. The ghost was the restless spirit of a child who had died under mysterious circumstances decades ago, its sorrow entwined with the fate of those who carried unresolved grief. According to local lore, the child appeared to those whose hearts were heavy, urging them to confront their past in order to find peace. "Many come here seeking answers," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But not all are ready for what the canyon will reveal." His words sent shivers down my spine. I pressed him for more details, but he only shook his head slowly. "The canyon does not give up its secrets easily. You must be willing to face the pain buried within." I left Elias with more questions than answers, but also with a renewed determination to uncover the truth behind the strange happenings. Armed with his cryptic warning and my own yearning for closure, I set out once more into the canyon. As dusk began to settle, I followed a narrow, winding trail that led deeper into the canyon. The air grew cooler, and the sky turned a deep, inky blue. The petroglyphs took on an otherworldly glow in the fading light, their ancient stories whispered in the language of shadows. I felt as if I were walking through a living museum, each step echoing with the voices of the past. The ghost child appeared again that evening, this time with a clarity that made my heart ache. I saw it standing near a cluster of jagged rocks, its form illuminated by the pale light of a crescent moon. The child's eyes met mine, filled with a profound sadness that mirrored my own hidden grief. It beckoned me silently, as if urging me to follow. With trepidation and a deep, inexplicable connection, I trailed the apparition as it led me toward a narrow passage in the canyon wall. Inside the passage, the air was thick with ancient energy. I pressed my hand against the rough surface of the rock and discovered strange carvings, symbols and images that seemed to tell a story of loss, of a family torn apart by fate. My pulse quickened as memories long suppressed bubbled to the surface, fragments of a childhood filled with unanswered questions, the mysterious disappearance of a sibling, and the unbearable weight of unresolved sorrow. Overwhelmed by emotion, I sank to my knees, letting the tears fall freely. In that moment, the ghost child hovered beside me, its presence gentle and unthreatening, as if it were a guardian spirit guiding me through the labyrinth of my own memories. I began to understand that the apparition was not here to harm me, but to confront me with the truth I had long avoided. That night, as a fierce storm began to rage outside, I found myself in a narrow alcove deep within the canyon. The wind howled like the anguished cries of the lost, and rain battered the rock walls with relentless fury. Clutching a small, weathered keepsake, a faded photograph of my family, I knew that I had to perform the ritual Elias had hinted at, an act of closure that could finally release me from the chains of my past. I arranged my meager offerings on a flat stone, the photograph, a makeshift candle I'd managed to light despite the storm, and a small flask of water. My hands trembled as I recited the words I had pieced together from Elias's warnings and my own intuition. The wind seemed to carry my whispered incantations, mingling with the roar of the storm. For a long, agonizing moment, the canyon fell silent, as if it were holding its breath. Then, in a surge of energy that both terrified and comforted me, the ghost child appeared one final time. Its face was no longer shrouded in sorrow. Instead, it radiated a gentle, peaceful glow. I could see the outlines of a smile, as if it were saying goodbye. The spectral figure moved closer, and in that silent exchange, I felt an overwhelming sense of forgiveness and release. It was as though my long-buried memories, the pain of losing a sibling, the grief of broken relationships, were finally acknowledged and understood. In that moment, I understood that the ghost child was not merely a remnant of ancient tragedy, but a manifestation of my own inner wounds. By facing it, by performing the ritual with every ounce of my heart, I was finally able to let go of the past. The storm outside subsided, and the oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a serene calm that spread through the canyon like a healing balm. In the quiet hours after the storm, I sat alone in the darkness of the canyon, watching as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. The spectral presence had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of its gentle farewell. I felt a profound emptiness, a void that had long been filled with sorrow, now giving way to a fragile hope. I realized that the path to healing was a long and uncertain one, but I had taken the first crucial step by facing my past head-on. I retraced my steps back to the RV, my mind still swirling with the images of the night's revelations. The journey home was bittersweet. Every mile I drove felt like a farewell to the pain that had haunted me for so long, and every turn of the road was a reminder that the memories of the canyon would forever be a part of me. The RV, with all its quirks and mechanical failures, carried me back to the reality of everyday life. But I was different now. I had glimpsed a truth hidden in the echoes of the canyon, a truth that whispered of loss, forgiveness, and the possibility of renewal. Back at the campsite, I spent a few quiet days reflecting and writing in my journal. The local legend of the ghost child, once a mere story, had become a powerful symbol of my own journey. I documented every detail, every shiver-inducing moment, determined to preserve the lessons learned in that sacred place. The pain of my past had not vanished completely, but I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I left the campsite with a renewed sense of purpose. Though I still carried scars from years of heartache and loss, I also carried the promise of healing, a promise born from the eerie, unforgettable encounters in the hidden canyon. I knew that the ghost child, the echo of my lost sibling, would forever be a part of my story, a reminder that sometimes the most profound journeys begin in the depths of our own sorrow. Now, as I look back on that fateful trip, I see it as a turning point, a moment when I chose to confront the darkness within me instead of running away from it. My RV journey through the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest was more than just an escape. It was a pilgrimage toward understanding, acceptance, and ultimately healing. The ghost child had shown me that the past, however painful, need not be a prison. It can be a guide, a beacon of light in the darkest corners of our hearts. Every time I pass through the desert on subsequent trips, I still feel the presence of that gentle spirit in the wind, a reminder that the echoes of our memories can lead us to a place of profound peace. My name is Ava Thompson, and while the scars of my past remain, my name is Jack Murray, and I'm 42 years old. This happened one autumn when I decided to leave behind the chaos of city life for a retreat in the Kaibab National Forest near the north rim of the Grand Canyon. I needed a fresh start, a time to reflect, and perhaps make peace with some of my past mistakes. I thought solitude would help me heal, and I wasn't entirely wrong, but I was unprepared for the darkness I was about to face. I had planned the trip meticulously, loading up my aging RV with supplies, maps, and a tattered guide on local legends that I'd collected over the years. My only companion on this journey was my loyal dog, Rex, and my old friend Carter Reeves, who had insisted on joining me. Carter was the kind of man who wore his heart on his sleeve, a thrill-seeker and believer in the mysterious, always ready to dive headfirst into the unknown. Our differing personalities sometimes clashed. I was cautious and methodical, while Carter embraced superstition and impulsiveness with reckless abandon. We set off on a cool, crisp morning. The drive was uneventful at first, our conversation a mix of nostalgic memories and cautious banter. However, even during the drive, I noticed Rex acting strangely. He would stare out the window at the passing pines, ears perked and eyes wide, as if he sensed something I could not. I chalked it up to the excitement of our destination and the crisp air, but deep down I felt a twinge of unease. After a long day on the road, we finally arrived at our destination, a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines and blanketed in an unsettling silence. The RV, our only haven, was parked in a small, almost hidden spot that I had found on an old map. The forest around us was dense, its shadows long and foreboding as dusk began to fall. We set up camp, and I took a moment to admire the natural beauty, despite the eerie stillness that seemed to envelop everything. That first night, as darkness settled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Rex's barking broke the silence repeatedly, his sharp cries echoing in the still air as he lunged toward the trees. Carter joked about ghost stories and local legends. He was particularly fascinated with the Navajo lore of the skinwalker, a shapeshifter that was said to embody both human and animal traits. I tried to laugh it off, though even I couldn't deny that the forest itself seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The following morning, we discovered our first tangible sign that something was terribly wrong. Just outside the RV, near a small clearing, were enormous tracks in the soft mud, a set of prints that didn't match any known animal in the region. Carter was quick to point out that they resembled those described in the skinwalker legends. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it as a misidentification, or perhaps a bear's tracks distorted by the damp earth, but deep down I couldn't ignore the prickling sensation that something supernatural was at play. As the day wore on, our equipment began to betray us. The RV's heaters started misfiring, producing more smoke than warmth, and the fuel gauge began fluctuating wildly, an ominous sign that our reliable mode of transport was becoming increasingly unreliable. Carter's impatience grew with each mechanical hiccup, and our differing approaches led to tense arguments about whether to press on or cut our losses and leave. I insisted that we needed to gather more information, and Carter, ever the believer in folklore, argued that this was nature's way of warning us. That evening, as the sky turned an inky black and the stars emerged one by one, our unease escalated. The forest seemed alive with unexplainable sounds. The distant, rhythmic thumping of something heavy moving through the underbrush and soft, indistinct whispers that danced around the edges of our camp. Rex became frantic, darting from one side of the RV to the other, his growls low and guttural. I could see the tension in Carter's eyes as he fumbled with a small, worn book of local legends, trying to find answers to what we were experiencing. Then, just as we were beginning to wonder if exhaustion was playing tricks on our minds, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure, barely discernible in the shadows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a trick of my tired eyes. But then it moved, shifting in a way that no human could. Its form was both familiar and grotesquely altered, like a mask twisted by something unspeakable. My heart pounded as I remembered the guide's descriptions. A skinwalker, a being of ancient lore that could take on many shapes. I whispered to Carter, urging him to look, and he, too, saw it. A brief glimpse before it melted into the darkness. In that moment, the rationality that I clung to began to crumble. The skinwalker was not simply a creature of myth, it was real, and it had chosen us as its next target. The creature seemed to relish the terror it instilled, its eyes glinting with a feral intelligence as it circled our clearing. With each passing minute, its presence grew more menacing, and the supernatural terror escalated into something palpable and violent. Carter, in a mix of fear and fascination, started to recall more from the legends he so adored. According to the lore, skinwalkers were known for their ability to mimic voices, to twist the familiar into something alien and terrifying. As if on cue, I began to hear voices that sounded like those of loved ones long gone, taunting, sorrowful, and distorted beyond recognition. At times, I even heard my own voice calling out from the darkness, urging me to run, to hide, as if my very identity was being mocked by this shape-shifting horror. The tension between Carter and me reached a boiling point. We argued fiercely over our next course of action. Should we fortify our position in the RV, or should we try to escape before the situation deteriorated further? Carter wanted to perform a protective ritual, something he had read about in his guide, involving the burning of sage and invoking Native American traditions for warding off evil. I, with my deep-seated skepticism, was reluctant to embrace what I considered superstition. But as the skinwalker's violent aggression became undeniable, when it suddenly lunged at our RV and managed to scratch Carter's arm, I knew that neither of us had much choice. We scrambled to secure what little defenses we could. With trembling hands, Carter set up a small circle of sage near the RV's door, while I barricaded the windows with anything I could find. Rex, ever the vigilant guardian, barked incessantly, his eyes darting between the shadows as if he was seeing every lurking menace. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning sage and the metallic tang of fear. That night, The confrontation escalated into sheer terror. The skinwalker's assault was brutal and swift. It attacked with a ferocity that left me reeling. Its claws raked at the RV, its distorted cries filling the night air. In the chaos, Carter was thrown to the ground, his injury deepening the urgency of our plight. I fought to keep my grip on reality, my mind a storm of adrenaline and disbelief, as I fumbled with a makeshift talisman we had cobbled together from bits of metal and old charms mentioned in the guide. Rex, sensing that the creature was momentarily distracted by the flickering flames of our sage circle, lunged forward. His unexpected bravery gave me a crucial opening. I managed to press the talisman against the skinwalker as it prowled near our barricade. For a heart-stopping moment, the creature hesitated, its grotesque features contorting as if in pain, before it roared and surged forward once more. The impact of its assault sent a shockwave through the RV, and I could see the fear etched on Carter's face as he struggled to rise despite the pain. In the ensuing minutes, time seemed to slow. The forest was alive with the sounds of our struggle, the relentless pounding of our hearts, the clashing of desperate resistance against ancient malevolent power. Amidst the chaos, I found myself whispering the protective words from the guide, a prayer that blended Native American tradition with my own desperate hope. The skinwalker's assault became erratic, as if the talisman had disrupted its focus, and slowly, very slowly, it began to withdraw into the dark recesses of the woods. The confrontation left us battered and shaken. Carter's wound was deep, and the RV bore the scars of the attack. Scratched metal and shattered glass stood as grim testimony to the night's horrors. In the cold light of dawn, with the forest eerily quiet once more, we sat in silence, the enormity of what had transpired weighing on us both. We knew that this was not the end. The skinwalker, or whatever malevolent force it embodied, had marked us. Its presence lingered, an omen of further terror that might someday return. In the days that followed, we attempted to repair the RV and plan our escape from the forest. The equipment issues that had plagued us earlier were now compounded by the damage inflicted during the assault. Our supplies were dwindling, and communication with the outside world remained impossible. The isolation was suffocating, and the constant tension between us over how to proceed threatened to tear our fragile alliance apart. Carter and I eventually reconciled our differences through the shared understanding that survival depended on unity. Our conversations turned from bitter arguments to sober planning sessions as we pored over maps and legends, searching for a path that might lead us back to civilization. I found myself increasingly drawn to the guide that had once been nothing more than a curiosity. Now, it was our lifeline, a testament to the ancient wisdom of the land and the rituals that might keep us safe. Every rustle of the pines, every distant echo, filled me with a renewed sense of dread. At night, I would lie awake, haunted by memories of that violent encounter and tormented by dreams in which the skinwalker's shifting form would chase me through endless corridors of shadow. Rex, ever faithful, remained by my side, a constant reminder of the fragility of our existence, in a world where ancient evils still lurked just beyond the veil of normalcy. After a harrowing week of continuous struggles, battling mechanical failures, physical injuries, and the creeping terror that the supernatural force might strike again, we finally managed to limp our way out of the forest. The drive was slow and painful, our RV a battered relic barely holding together. Yet, with each mile that took us farther from Kaibab, the oppressive weight of the forest began to lift, replaced by a tentative hope that we might someday heal from the scars of that night. In the aftermath, I found that my perspective on life had been irrevocably altered. The rationality I had long clung to was shaken by an encounter with something that defied logic and reason. I realized that there are forces in the world that are older and more powerful than our modern understanding can fathom. The skinwalker was not merely a creature of myth. It was a manifestation of a primordial darkness, a force that could not be reasoned with or understood by mere human minds. Carter, too, was forever changed. His initial fascination with the supernatural had given way to a sober recognition of its danger. The injury he sustained was a constant reminder of our vulnerability, both physical and spiritual. As we eventually returned to our separate lives, the bond forged in the crucible of our shared horror remained unspoken yet unbreakable. A testament to the fact that sometimes survival depends not only on physical resilience, but also on the strength of the human spirit in the face of unyielding darkness. Looking back, I still struggle with the memories of that autumn in Kaibab National Forest. The image of the skinwalker's shifting form, the agonized screams in the dead of night, and the whispered legends of ancient power continue to haunt me. I now understand that there are stories that are best left untold, and experiences that, once lived, forever change the way we see the world. Yet, despite everything, I carry with me the lessons learned in those shadowed pines, that fear can be a formidable enemy, but unity and the courage to face the unknown are the only weapons we truly have. Now, whenever I see the distant silhouette of a pine or the flicker of a flame in the night, I'm reminded of that fateful encounter. I am reminded that the line between myth and reality is perilously thin, and that sometimes, when you venture into the heart of darkness, you may find that it stares back at you with eyes that have seen too much. And as I continue my life, I do so with a cautious respect for the ancient forces that dwell in the hidden corners of our world, ever vigilant of the whispers among the pines. My name is Eli Turner. I'm 32 years old, and this happened in late autumn along the rugged Black Canyon Trail in the Coconino National Forest of northern Arizona. I had long been drawn to the wild, isolated corners of our state, places where nature's beauty intertwined with whispers of ancient legends. When my friends Riley, Jonah, Mia, and I decided to document local paranormal lore for our fledgling folklore podcast, I never imagined that our adventure would blur the line between myth and bone-chilling reality. We loaded up our aging RV with gear that, in hindsight, seemed woefully inadequate for the extremes we were about to face. The vehicle rattled along uneven roads, its engine groaning like an old man's protest, while our excitement battled the creeping apprehension that accompanied each turn. I remember how the early autumn chill seeped into our bones as we approached the remote stretch of the Black Canyon Trail, a place rumored to be steeped in legends of shapeshifters and ancient curses. The first few hours passed in a blur of animated conversation. Riley, with her daring spirit and contagious enthusiasm, was all for venturing out immediately, insisting we explore the surrounding trails under the cloak of twilight. Jonah, ever the skeptic, kept his tongue firmly in cheek, remarking that any supernatural tale was nothing more than clever local folklore. Mia, on the other hand, was noticeably quieter. Her deep connection to nature and an almost tangible sensitivity to its secrets made her an unspoken oracle of the land. Despite our differing temperaments, the common thrill of discovery bound us together. That first night, as we set up a makeshift camp beside our RV, the winds whispered through the pines like distant voices. I sat by the window of our cramped RV, watching the stars emerge in the vast, unpolluted sky. The air was still, too still, almost expectant, as if nature itself were holding its breath. It wasn't long before our conversation drifted to the legends Mia had mentioned on our drive in. She recounted the local Navajo stories about skinwalkers, shapeshifters known to assume the appearance and voice of their victims. Although Jonah scoffed at the notion, I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine as I listened. Around midnight, a sudden downpour rattled the RV's windows. The rain was relentless, forcing us into the cramped space where tensions rose alongside the storm's fury. Our equipment, already unreliable, began to malfunction. Our communication devices flickered in and out, and the battery-powered lanterns sputtered weakly. In the midst of our bickering over whose fault it was that we'd come so unprepared, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of foreboding. I had just dozed off in a moment of fragile repose when I was abruptly awakened by rustling sounds outside and a distant, almost imperceptible whisper. I couldn't be sure if it was the wind or something else. The voices were faint, distorted, yet distinctly human. I nudged Riley, who sat huddled by the window with wide eyes reflecting the storm's erratic flashes. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the dark expanse beyond the RV's flimsy walls. The following morning, the storm had left its mark. Puddles had turned to muddy tracks, and the forest outside seemed to have shifted, its once familiar trails now alien and foreboding. Determined to investigate, we decided to split up our tasks. Riley and I would scout a nearby ridge for any signs of disturbance, while Jonah and Mia stayed behind to check our gear and document any anomalies in the RV. As Riley and I trekked along a narrow, rocky path, the eerie silence of the forest was punctuated by the occasional cry of a distant bird. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves sent a shiver through my body. I kept thinking of Mia's soft warnings and the ancient lore she cherished, stories of entities that walk the night, blurring the lines between man and monster. It was then that I noticed something peculiar. A series of deep, almost ritualistic scratches on the bark of a towering juniper tree. The markings weren't natural. They were deliberate, etched with a precision that hinted at an intent far more sinister than mere vandalism. By midday, we regrouped at the RV and pored over our notes and photos. Jonah's usual sarcasm was absent. Even he couldn't dismiss the disturbing images Mia had captured on her camera. An inexplicable red glow in the distance, as if the forest itself was bleeding. We huddled together, sharing our apprehensions, when Mia softly mentioned that the locals had long spoken of a malevolent force in this very area. A skinwalker known for mimicking voices and luring wanderers off safe paths. That evening, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The RV's interior, cramped and poorly insulated, seemed to vibrate with unseen energy. I found myself repeatedly glancing at the door, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond. As dusk settled, Riley suggested we venture out one more time, this time armed with little more than our flashlights and a determination to uncover the truth. Reluctantly, I agreed. We'd planned to document everything for our podcast, convinced that tangible evidence would dispel Jonah's doubts and validate Mia's fears. We ventured into the darkening forest, our flashlights casting erratic beams across ancient trees and tangled undergrowth. The further we went, the more the familiar landscape seemed to morph into a labyrinth of twisted shadows and murmuring winds. My heart pounded as we reached a clearing where the rain had left the ground slick and glistening. There, on a large flat rock, were fresh scratches, similar to those from the previous day, but now accompanied by symbols carved with deliberate care. "Look at this," Riley murmured, her voice barely audible over the whisper of the wind. I knelt down, running my fingers over the incisions, feeling a chill ripple through me. It was as if someone had etched these symbols with a mixture of anger and despair, leaving behind a trace of a curse that had haunted these woods for centuries. Suddenly, A low, guttural sound emerged from behind us, a sound that resembled a deep growl mixed with a human-like whisper. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. In the corner of my vision, a figure shifted between the trees. I strained my eyes, trying to discern its shape in the murk. It was then I realized with a jolt that the figure seemed to be mimicking the voice of someone I knew. A voice that wasn't mine, yet was eerily familiar. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something far more malevolent at work. Riley grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Eli, did you hear that?" It sounded like my voice, but it wasn't mine. I couldn't form a response as the sound echoed again, a distorted, mocking imitation that set every nerve on edge. We retreated hastily back to the RV, our earlier resolve dissolving into raw fear. Inside, Jonah and Mia were waiting, their faces etched with concern. Jonah, who had spent the day analyzing the gear and our evidence, was uncharacteristically silent. Mia, however, seemed even more troubled. "I was reading about this," she said in a hushed tone, her eyes dark with worry. "The legends speak of a skinwalker that can mimic voices perfectly. It uses this trick to sow distrust and confusion among its prey." Her words, though soft, carried the weight of ancient sorrow and undeniable warning. That night, the terror reached its apex. The RV's engine rumbled quietly in the background as we huddled together, trying to muster some semblance of courage. I took the first watch, sitting by the cracked window, my flashlight a feeble beacon against the impenetrable darkness. Every rustle outside sent my heart into a frenzied drumbeat. At one point, I heard a whisper so close that I could almost feel a breath on my ear. "Eli, come outside." It beckoned in a voice that was mine, yet distorted with malice. Unable to resist the pull of curiosity and dread, I cautiously stepped out into the night. The cold air was biting, and the only sounds were the persistent drips of water and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. As I scanned the darkness, a shape darted across my path. I raised my flashlight, its beam falling on a patch of disturbed earth where fresh prints were visible. Prints that weren't human. The realization struck me hard. Whatever was stalking us was not of this world. I returned to the RV with a mix of adrenaline and dread, recounting my experience to the others in a hushed, trembling voice. The ensuing discussion was a cacophony of fear, disbelief, and desperate logic. Riley insisted that we confront the entity, to lure it away using the ancient talismans Mia had hastily gathered from local lore. Jonah, on the other hand, was frantically trying to salvage our malfunctioning communication equipment, convinced that help might be on its way if we could only signal out into the void. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity of silent terror. It was around 3 a.m. when the unthinkable happened. I was startled awake by a blood-curdling scream, an ear-piercing wail that shattered the stillness of the night. In that moment, I knew one of us had fallen prey to the relentless force outside. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and looked over to see Riley trembling, her eyes brimming with tears. I heard it. From outside, it wasn't a human scream, she whispered, her voice barely intelligible. Before we could fully process what was happening, the RV's door burst open. I scrambled to secure it while Jonah rushed forward, flashlight in hand, to see what had intruded upon our fragile sanctuary. In the beam of his light, I caught sight of a figure, tall, gaunt, and exuding an aura of ancient malice. It moved with a predatory grace, its eyes glinting with an unnatural light. As it stepped into view, a horrific realization washed over me. It wasn't a stranger at all, but an evil doppelganger, a mimic of one of us, a grotesque distortion of our own identities. In that surreal moment, chaos erupted. Jonah's rational mind shattered completely, his earlier skepticism melting away in the face of undeniable terror. The creature's voice, a twisted mockery of familiar tones, echoed through the RV, sowing discord and panic among us. Mia's quiet prayers, recited in a trembling whisper, filled the air as she clutched her talisman, a small, hand-carved piece of wood inscribed with ancient symbols. Riley and I fumbled for any means to defend ourselves, our only shelter now a fragile barrier against an unearthly force. I took charge, rallying the group as best as I could. "We need to hold our ground until dawn," I commanded, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. "Stay close, and don't let it isolate any of us." But the creature, clever and ruthless, seemed to have no intention of playing by our rules. It moved silently between the shadows, its presence palpable in every flicker of light, every creak of the RV's old frame. For what felt like hours, we battled our terror, the creature's intermittent attacks and the oppressive sense of being hunted overwhelming our defenses. At one point, I caught a glimpse of Jonah being dragged toward a dark corner of the RV. I lunged after him, but when I reached the spot, he was gone, taken by the malevolent force that now stalked us with a singular, vengeful purpose. The loss of Jonah was a blow that shattered our already fragile resolve. The RV, once our mobile haven, now felt like a death trap, its walls closing in around us as if the very structure were complicit in our demise. The night gave way reluctantly to a gray, agonizing dawn. As the first weak rays of sunlight pierced through the tattered curtains, the creature seemed to recede into the forest, leaving behind a silence that was as oppressive as it was eerie. We emerged from the RV in a daze, the cold light of morning doing little to wash away the horror of the night. I found myself staring at the footprint marks left on the muddy ground, evidence that confirmed our worst fears. The creature had not only been real, but it had also claimed a part of our world, leaving us to grapple with a loss that was both personal and inexplicable. In the aftermath, we gathered what little we had left, our scattered equipment, our frayed nerves, and our shattered sense of reality. Mia, eyes red from both tears and exhaustion, whispered that the ancient lore was more than mere myth. "It's real," she said, her voice quivering, "and it will always be here, waiting in the shadows for those who dare disturb its domain." Riley, normally the bold spirit among us, could only nod silently, her bravado now replaced with a haunted resignation. We spent the rest of that day in a surreal fog of mourning and disbelief. The RV was packed with a heavy sadness as we prepared to leave the Black Canyon Trail, its eerie beauty now forever tainted by the horrors we had encountered. I found myself repeatedly replaying the night's events in my mind, the mocking voice, the relentless pursuit, the heart-wrenching disappearance of Jonah, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were leaving behind more than just a physical location. We were leaving a part of ourselves, a piece of our innocence that had been irretrievably lost in the darkness. Every mile we put between us and the haunted forest felt like a temporary reprieve from a nightmare that had become all too real. Yet, deep down, I knew that the shadows of that night would linger in my dreams and in the whispered legends of northern Arizona for years to come. I later dedicated an entire episode of our podcast to that fateful night. In that recording, my voice trembled as I recounted every detail. The failing equipment, the sudden downpour, the unnerving symbols etched into the bark of ancient trees, and the final soul-crushing encounter with a creature that defied all natural laws. The episode ended with a somber reflection on survival and the price we pay when we trespass into realms best left undisturbed. Our audience listened, transfixed by the raw authenticity of our terror and the unmistakable sense that the supernatural is never far away in these forgotten corners of the world. As for me, every time I close my eyes, I see Jonah's desperate eyes and hear that cruel, imitative whisper echoing in the darkness. I wonder if the skinwalker will ever truly be gone, or if it will one day return to claim another soul, wandering too far from the light. I try to convince myself that we left that cursed trail behind, but the deep, primal fear that something ancient and malevolent watches from the shadows remains with me always. Now, whenever I drive down a lonely road or camp under a vast, star-strewn sky, I recall that grim night on the Black Canyon Trail. I remember the taste of fear, the desperate unity we clung to in the face of an unexplainable terror, and the heartbreaking realization that survival sometimes comes at an unbearable cost. And in those quiet moments I can almost hear the forest whispering, a timeless murmur that promises that the darkness is always just beyond the reach of the fading light. I know now that some legends aren't just stories to be told. They are warnings etched in the very soul of the land, reminders that even in our modern world, ancient evils still lurk in the shadows, waiting for the moment to remind us that we are never truly alone. That is the truth I carry with me every day, and it is the truth I share, hoping that by recounting our ordeal, others might tread with caution in places where the past refuses to remain buried. This harrowing night changed us forever. My name is Evelyn Hayes, and I'm 35 years old. This all happened last summer, when I set out alone in my old RV to the rugged landscapes of Sedona and Oak Creek Canyon, seeking solace from a grief that had weighed on me for far too long. I had left behind the familiar chaos of my everyday life in search of a quiet place where I could confront the raw pain of losing someone irreplaceable. With every mile the RV rumbled along the winding desert roads. I felt both the sting of my loss and a cautious hope that isolation might bring the answers and healing I so desperately craved. Departure and the road to isolation. The journey began on a clear sunlit morning, the sky a brilliant blue stretching above endless red rock and sagebrush. I'd packed the RV with essentials, a few changes of clothes, a well-worn journal, and even a small collection of books on local legends and Native American lore. I wasn't superstitious, but I'd always found comfort in the idea that the land held memories, and that it might whisper secrets to those who listened closely. Driving along the deserted highways, I couldn't shake a peculiar sensation. Sometimes, during the long stretches of silence, I would feel a sudden chill, as if the desert itself was exhaling a long-forgotten sorrow. And on more than one occasion, I caught fleeting glimpses of shapes in the distance, figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving me to wonder if they were simply tricks of the light or echoes of the past. Arrival at the campsite. After several hours, I finally arrived at a remote campsite nestled against the backdrop of towering red rock formations. The RV was parked in a small clearing, bordered by gnarled junipers and ancient pines. There was an otherworldly beauty to the place, a silent majesty that made it feel as though I had stepped into a realm where time itself had been suspended. I spent the first day unpacking and settling in, trying to find some peace in the isolation. The RV, though modest and creaky, was my sanctuary against the vast, indifferent wilderness. I took long walks on the nearby trails, the rustle of dry leaves and the whisper of the wind filling the quiet spaces around me. Yet, even in that serene landscape, there was something subtly off, a persistent sense that I wasn't entirely alone. The first ominous clue. One cool morning, as I sipped coffee on the RV's small porch, I noticed something unusual. Right at my doorstep lay a small, intricately carved toy. It was a tiny figure, perhaps a child's plaything, made of dark wood and etched with symbols that reminded me of Native American craftsmanship. The delicate curves and mysterious markings sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know how it had arrived, but it felt like a relic from a time long past, a tangible connection to a history steeped in both sorrow and mystery. I tucked the toy inside my journal, its silent presence a puzzle that I couldn't immediately solve. That day, as I roamed the rugged trails, I kept an eye out for more clues, but nothing else seemed amiss. Still, the unease gnawed at me, a quiet prelude to what was yet to come. Unexplained phenomena and lingering memories. That night, as the desert sky unfolded in a dazzling display of stars, I settled in for what I hoped would be a restful sleep. But sleep eluded me. I awoke repeatedly to the sound of distant laughter, a light, tinkling sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the sound of children playing, yet there were no children in sight. Every time I peered through the RV's window, I caught only the flicker of movement among the shadows, like figures dancing just at the edge of vision. In the dim light before dawn, I began to see them. Ghostly apparitions of children, their forms semi-transparent and bathed in a sorrowful glow. They would appear for only moments, flitting past the RV, disappearing behind the red rocks, and then vanish without a trace. Their eyes, when I could catch a glimpse, were filled with a longing that mirrored my own hidden grief. At first, I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, if my loneliness and sorrow were conjuring up these spectral visitors. But the apparitions were too vivid, too persistent. Their presence was a quiet, unnerving reminder that the past was not easily forgotten. Seeking answers in local lore, determined to understand what was happening, I decided to leave the relative isolation of the campsite for a day. I drove to a small town nearby where I sought out a local library known for its collection of regional histories and folklore. It wasn't long before I met Mr. Albright, an elderly historian with gentle eyes and a voice that carried the weight of countless stories. Sitting across from him at a time-worn table, I recounted the strange occurrences, the carved toy, the spectral children, the inexplicable whispers carried by the wind. Mr. Albright listened intently before leaning forward. "You've encountered the mirages of the past," he said softly. "These are the echoes of children who vanished long ago under tragic circumstances. Their spirits linger, bound by sorrow and unfulfilled promise." He explained that decades earlier there had been a series of mysterious disappearances in these parts. Several children, beloved by their communities, had vanished without explanation. Over time, the tragedy had been woven into local lore, with tales of ghostly children appearing in the very landscapes where they were lost. According to legend, their apparitions were not malevolent, but were instead manifestations of deep, unresolved grief, both personal and communal. His words resonated with me, stirring a mix of empathy and terror. The idea that the land could hold such sorrow, that it could echo the pain of those who were forgotten, was both beautiful and haunting. I purchased an old book on the subject from Mr. Albright, its yellowed pages promising to reveal more about the tragic history of this place. Intensifying encounters and a blurred reality. Returning to my campsite with the weight of this new knowledge, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The spectral children grew bolder in their appearances. They were now not mere fleeting glimpses, but vivid, sorrowful figures that seemed to watch me from the edges of the RV's windows. At times, their laughter was replaced by soft, plaintive cries that echoed through the night, as if calling out for something lost long ago. In the quiet hours of the early morning, I found myself conversing with them in my mind, a desperate attempt to understand their pain. The boundaries between my memories of loss and the supernatural manifestations began to blur. I wondered if my own grief was drawing these spirits to me, as if the land recognized in me a kindred sorrow. Sleep became a rare commodity, as every rustle of the wind or creak of the RV was magnified into a potential sign of another visitation. I began to record everything in my journal: the strange sounds, the fleeting images, the overwhelming sense of melancholy that pervaded every moment. Each entry was a step closer to unraveling the mystery, even as it plunged me deeper into my own introspection. The storm and the unveiling of a hidden memorial. One night, as I sat by the RV's small stove, a violent desert storm began to brew. The wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, and rain battered the RV with an intensity that seemed almost vengeful. It was during this tempest that the ghostly children took on a more urgent form. Their apparitions converged, and amidst the chaos of the storm, I perceived a clear, almost beckoning silhouette emerging from the tumult, a faint outline of an ancient ruin hidden among the red rocks. Compelled by an inner force I couldn't fully understand, I donned my jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the raging storm. The wind whipped against me, and the rain blurred my vision, but I pressed on, drawn toward the spectral trail left by the children. The landscape transformed under the deluge. The familiar red rocks became ghostly monoliths, and the desert floor turned into a quagmire of mud and memories. After what felt like an eternity battling the elements, I reached the ruin. It was an overgrown stone structure, half swallowed by time and nature. Etched into its surface were names and symbols, fragments of history that told the story of loss and remembrance. This hidden memorial, I realized, was dedicated to the lost children of the past, a silent testament to a tragedy that had been buried by time but not by sorrow. As I stood there, shivering from the cold and the shock of revelation, the ghostly apparitions of the children gathered around me. They did not approach with malice or anger, but with a desperate need for acknowledgement, a silent plea for their pain to be recognized. In that surreal moment, the veil between past and present lifted, and I understood that these were not malevolent spirits but the lingering echoes of grief, bound to this sacred ground. I knelt before the memorial, and with trembling hands I placed the carved toy, the mysterious token that had first arrived at my doorstep, at the base of the stone. I whispered an apology, a promise of remembrance, and a plea for forgiveness. The wind seemed to carry my words, and for a few long, charged moments the storm subsided as if in response. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm abated, leaving behind a profound silence and the soft, fading echoes of children's voices. A cathartic transformation. The following morning, the storm-washed landscape glistened under a pale sun, and I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest. The spectral children had receded, their images dissolving into the early light as if they had never been. In their place, I felt a deep, bittersweet release, a catharsis that came from confronting not only the collective sorrow of the lost children, but also the personal grief that had haunted me for so long. I spent the day at the memorial site, carefully sketching the names and symbols in my journal, preserving the memory of the tragedy that had unfolded here. I realized that my journey had been about more than isolation. It had been about facing the unhealed parts of my soul, acknowledging the sorrow that binds us all to our pasts, and finding a way to honor the memories of those who were lost. Returning to my RV, I took extra care to secure it against the lingering winds and the soft murmur of the desert. Over the next few days, I resumed my quiet life at the campsite with a newfound sense of peace. The ghostly apparitions had become less frequent, their urgent presence replaced by a quiet watchfulness. It was as if by acknowledging their pain, I had allowed them to finally rest. Every evening, as I sat by a small campfire and wrote in my journal, I felt the connection between my own heartache and the sorrow of the land. The experience had transformed my grief from a solitary burden into a shared story, a story of loss, remembrance, and the quiet hope of healing. I had learned that sometimes the ghosts we encounter are not foes to be vanquished, but echoes of pain that demand understanding and compassion. The journey home and a lingering memory. After a week of reflection and renewal, I knew it was time to return to civilization. Packing up the RV was bittersweet. I had come to see this remote corner of Sedona not merely as an escape from the world, but as a sacred space where the past and present converged in a delicate dance of memory and hope. As I drove away from the campsite, the red rocks and ancient memorials receded into the distance, yet the experience left an indelible mark on my soul. The drive back was quiet and contemplative. I replayed every moment in my mind, the carved toy, the eerie laughter, the ghostly apparitions, and the cathartic encounter at the ruin. I understood now that grief is a journey, one that we must traverse slowly and with great care. The landscape of my heart had been scarred by loss, but like the desert after a storm, it held the promise of renewal. I still carry the memory of that summer with me. When I close my eyes, I see the ruins bathed in the soft light of dawn, and hear the gentle laughter of children that once filled the air. I have learned to honor the past without being consumed by it, to let the echoes of sorrow guide me toward healing rather than despair. As I continue my life, I remain ever watchful for the silent voices of the past, those subtle hints that remind us of the interconnectedness of our lives with the broader tapestry of history. My journey into the heart of Sedona taught me that sometimes the most profound encounters are not with monsters or malevolence, but with the fragile, enduring human spirit that persists even in the face of unimaginable loss. Now, whenever I pass through a quiet stretch of desert or see a weathered stone bearing an ancient inscription, I feel a connection, a whisper of gratitude and remembrance that bridges the gap between what was lost and what remains. And though the ghostly apparitions have faded from my daily life, the lessons they imparted continue to shape my understanding of grief, memory, and the quiet strength required to face both. I often return to that remote campsite in my dreams, where the wind still carries the soft laughter of children and the ancient stones tell stories of sorrow and hope. In that sacred silence, I find a piece of myself that was lost long ago, and in the act of remembrance I find the courage to live again. This journey, as surreal and heart-wrenching as it was, became a part of me. A chapter in my life that taught me that healing often comes through embracing the pain rather than denying it. And so, as I drive along life's winding roads, I do so with a heart a little lighter, carrying the echoes of the past as a reminder that even in the depths of sorrow, there is a path toward renewal. In the quiet aftermath of my journey, I continue to write and reflect on what it means to confront the specters of our own histories, both personal and collective. The land of Sedona, with its red rocks and ancient secrets, taught me that every ending can be the start of a new beginning, if we are brave enough to listen to the whispers of the past and let them guide us toward a future filled with understanding and compassion. My name is Evan Parker, and I'm 35 years old. This all began one crisp October when I decided to leave behind the relentless pace of city life for an RV camping trip deep in the rugged beauty of Oak Creek Canyon, northern Arizona. I'd been planning this journey for months, convinced that a few days in nature would help me sort out some inner turmoil, and perhaps even spark some adventure. I never imagined the nightmares that would follow. I wasn't alone in this venture. I'd invited 3 friends along for what we hoped would be a refreshing escape. Lila Martinez, whose sensitive nature and fascination with local legends often had her lost in thought, was eager to experience firsthand the ancient lore of the Navajo people. Carlos Rivera, always the adrenaline junkie, was excited by the prospect of high-risk explorations, despite knowing that sometimes his impulsiveness put us all in danger. And then there was Mary Thompson, the steady mediator among us. Practical and caring, Mary's calming influence often kept our more reckless tendencies in check. Our RV was an aging model, a clunky, temperamental machine that had seen better days. Even during the drive out, the electrical system flickered sporadically, and the engine groaned as if protesting the long journey ahead. We'd stocked up on supplies, though in hindsight they were hardly adequate for the isolation we would soon encounter. A few essential communication devices were in our kit, but a malfunctioning radio meant that any call for help might not reach us. We arrived in Oak Creek Canyon as the sun dipped low over the red rock formations, painting the sky with fiery hues that belied the chill settling in the air. The drive up had been long and filled with mild banter, but as soon as we began setting up camp, underlying tensions emerged. I had meticulously mapped out our route, suggesting a site near the heart of the canyon that promised both stunning views and a sense of isolation. Carlos, however, was quick to challenge the choice, arguing that we should push further into the wilderness for more excitement. Mary tried to bridge the gap between his impulsiveness and my cautious planning, but even she couldn't completely quell the disquiet that the area stirred in us. That first night, as we gathered around a crackling fire outside the RV, the landscape around us seemed to hold its breath. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of the juniper trees and the distant murmur of the creek. As I sat there, the creeping sensation that something was watching me gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. It started with something small, a barely audible whisper carried on the wind. I was the first to notice it, a soft, almost childlike laughter that seemed to echo from the dark recesses of the canyon. I dismissed it as a trick of the wind, but when Lila mentioned that she had seen strange, shifting shadows just beyond the circle of our firelight, unease spread among us. The next morning, while exploring the campsite, I stumbled upon a series of footprints near the RV. They were odd, too large for any human, yet oddly humanoid in form. Lila knelt beside them, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "These aren't ordinary prints," she murmured, running her fingers lightly over the impressions. "They're almost deliberate." By the time night fell again, our RV seemed to be encircled by an atmosphere of palpable dread. The radio, which had been a silent casualty of the earlier drive, began emitting a persistent static. Beneath the hiss of the interference, I could make out faint, almost indistinguishable voices speaking in a language I couldn't place. The voices were punctuated by long, drawn-out pauses that made my skin crawl. Over dinner, the conversation turned to local lore. A few residents from a nearby Navajo community had shared warnings with us earlier that day. In hushed tones, they mentioned skinwalkers, shape-shifting entities deeply woven into the fabric of indigenous legend. According to the elders, these beings were not mere ghosts or specters, but entities that could assume any form they desired, often as a form of vengeance or curse. One elderly man had even handed me a worn, handwritten note recounting an old tale of a vengeful spirit tied to a witch's curse. I read the note aloud, my voice trembling slightly as I recounted its dire warnings. Carlos scoffed, calling it local superstition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. The first confrontation. It was on the third night that the true horror began. I had taken one of the early watch shifts, sitting alone in the dim light of the RV as the storm clouds gathered above. The wind began to howl, and the static from the radio morphed into something even more disturbing, a deep, guttural moan that resonated with an unholy timbre. I stepped outside, the cold rain pelting my face as I scanned the darkness with a flashlight. That's when I saw it. At the very edge of the canyon, a gaunt, shifting humanoid figure. Its eyes glowed with an eerie luminescence, and its form flickered like a poorly tuned television screen. It was a skinwalker, exactly as the legends had described. A creature born of ancient curses and the dark magic of forgotten rituals. My heart thundered in my chest as I stumbled back inside, nearly colliding with Mary, who was already wide awake. "Evan, what did you see?" she whispered, fear lacing her voice. I barely managed to recount the apparition before a sudden, violent crash outside shattered the tense silence. The creature, it seemed, was not content to merely observe. It had left deep, claw-like marks on the side of the RV, marks that looked disturbingly real. The following day was marked by a palpable tension that stifled any attempt at normalcy. Carlos, undeterred by our brush with the supernatural, proposed that we investigate further. "This is the thrill of it all," he insisted, his eyes glinting with both excitement and a hint of madness. Lila, however, was visibly shaken. "We're meddling with forces we don't understand," she argued softly, her hands trembling as she clutched an old photograph of a Navajo elder they'd met earlier. I tried to mediate, torn between the rational need to document everything and the instinct to flee. "We need answers," I said, though even my voice betrayed uncertainty. "Let's at least see if there's any truth to these stories. There might be something in those ancient symbols carved into the rocks near the old outbuilding we passed earlier." Mary, ever the voice of caution, agreed. "But we must be careful. I don't want anyone getting hurt because we're chasing shadows." Despite her words, I could sense her fear, a silent acknowledgement that whatever we were dealing with was far beyond our control. The group set out toward the abandoned outbuilding, a decrepit structure half hidden by overgrown brush near the canyon's edge. The building, once a ranger station, now lay in ruins, a perfect canvas for the scars of time and the weight of forgotten rituals. On the walls we discovered carvings, intricate symbols that hinted at a ritual meant either to invoke or ward off supernatural forces. The symbols were archaic, their origins lost in time, but one thing was clear. They were tied to the legends of skinwalkers and the curses of witches. As I traced one of the symbols with my fingertip, the temperature seemed to drop precipitously. A cold, oppressive feeling washed over me, as if I'd trespassed into a sacred, forbidden domain. It was then that we heard it, a mournful, echoing wail that reverberated off the canyon walls. The sound was unmistakable, like a banshee's cry, sending chills down my spine. Carlos, ever the daredevil, suggested we record the sounds, convinced that we'd capture undeniable evidence of the supernatural. Lila hesitated, her eyes wide with dread. "Some things aren't meant to be recorded," she murmured. But before we could decide, the wailing subsided, leaving us with an unsettling silence and a growing sense of impending doom. Determined to understand what we were up against, I contacted a Navajo elder named Yazzie, whose reputation as a keeper of ancient wisdom preceded him. We arranged to meet him at a small rural trading post not far from our campsite. The journey there was fraught with unease. Our malfunctioning radio was now completely dead, and the storm that had gathered seemed intent on following us. When we finally met Yazzie, his weathered face and solemn eyes spoke of a lifetime steeped in the lore of the land. He listened intently as we recounted our experiences, his expression growing graver with every detail. "You have disturbed forces older than your kind," he said quietly, his voice resonating with both warning and sorrow. "These lands are sacred, and the skinwalker you saw is but one manifestation of the curse that lingers here. It is not merely a phantom that haunts the night, it is a predator, and its hunger is insatiable." Yazzie recommended a series of protective rituals and cautioned us against provoking the entity further. He explained that while the skinwalker and its kin might sometimes merely linger in the shadows, their violent nature could be unleashed if angered. "Do not challenge it," he warned, "for in doing so, you may incur its wrath." His words were as clear as they were chilling. Back at the RV, a heavy storm had rolled in, drenching the red rocks and turning the canyon into a chaotic blur of shadows and rain. We spent hours fortifying our temporary shelter as best we could, boarding up windows, rigging makeshift barriers, and establishing a rotating watch. Despite our efforts, the oppressive atmosphere remained, as though the very air was laden with malice. During one of my watch shifts, I sat alone in the cramped interior of the RV, the storm's fury outside amplifying every creak and groan of the aging vehicle. The static on the dead radio had returned, now overlaid with indistinct murmurs that grew louder and more insistent with each passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by the skinwalker, but by something even more malevolent lurking in the darkness. It was in the depths of that stormy night that the supernatural force made its most brutal move. As I patrolled the perimeter of the RV with my flashlight in hand, a sudden, bone-chilling scream tore through the night. I raced back to the RV, my heart pounding so violently I feared it might burst from my chest. Inside, Mary was already tending to a wound, a deep, jagged gash on her arm that I hadn't seen before. She looked pale and shaken, insisting that something had attacked her while she was outside. Carlos, his earlier bravado replaced by a grim determination, was already preparing to confront whatever had inflicted the injury. "We need to get out of here," he insisted, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and anger. "This thing is getting bolder. We can't just hide and hope it goes away." But I wasn't ready to abandon our position just yet. I knew that running in panic could make us vulnerable. Instead, I gathered what little first aid we had, bandaged Mary's wound, and suggested that we try to track the creature's movements. Lila, who had been silently scribbling in her journal throughout the ordeal, whispered, "I saw it again, right at the tree line, the figure shifting and watching us." The decision was made to venture out into the storm, despite the risk. Carlos, determined to capture proof of the supernatural, led the way with a camera in hand, while Mary and Lila followed closely, their faces etched with dread. I stayed slightly behind, my senses on high alert as the rain hammered down, distorting the familiar landscape into a nightmarish vision. In the near-total darkness, we reached the edge of the canyon, where the carved symbols from the ruined outbuilding glowed faintly under the intermittent lightning. There, in the flash of a forked bolt, I saw it clearly, a gaunt figure, its eyes burning with an unnatural light, standing motionless as if waiting for us. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The skinwalker was not just an apparition. It was a living embodiment of ancient malice, its presence radiating a palpable threat. Without warning, the creature lunged. The attack was ferocious and swift. Carlos's camera fell to the ground as he instinctively flinched away. I swung a heavy branch in a desperate bid to defend us, but the creature was agile, dodging with an eerie fluidity. In the chaos, I heard a guttural snarl and the sound of someone, screaming in pain. When the tumult subsided, we found that Mary was gone. Panic surged through us as we searched frantically, our shouts swallowed by the roaring wind. Lila's voice broke as she clutched my arm, tears streaming down her face. "We have to get her back," she sobbed, her words a desperate plea against the encroaching darkness. We split up in a frantic, disorganized search, the storm and the oppressive aura of the canyon making every step a struggle. I moved cautiously along a narrow trail, the flash of lightning illuminating twisted shapes among the rocks. It wasn't long before I discovered Mary's lifeless body, sprawled at the base of a jagged outcrop, her eyes staring blankly at the void. The sight was too horrifying to comprehend, a brutal reminder that we were dealing with forces that cared little for our human frailties. In that moment, every argument and every reckless decision fell away. We had become prey to an ancient evil, and the consequences were irrevocable. Carlos, his face now a mask of raw anguish, muttered curses as he retrieved his fallen camera. Lila, inconsolable, clung to me as we gathered what little courage remained. Determined to survive and honor Mary's memory, we resolved to confront the terror head-on. The storm intensified, and the oppressive atmosphere reached a fever pitch. We returned to the RV to regroup and fortify our defenses, all the while haunted by the specter of Mary's fate. I recalled Yazzy's warning about provoking the skinwalker further, but our desperation left us no choice. With trembling hands, I led Carlos and Lila through the maze of rock formations toward the ritual site once more. The carved symbols seemed to pulsate with a dark energy in the intermittent flashes of lightning. In a quiet, desperate ritual of our own devising, combining Yazzy's protective chants with our own prayers, we attempted to invoke a force to repel the creature. The air around us vibrated with an almost electric charge, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a shimmer of light enveloping us. Then, as if in response to our plea, the skinwalker appeared, its eyes, now more malevolent than ever, fixed on us with a predatory glint. The entity advanced slowly, deliberately, as if to savor our fear. Carlos, despite his earlier bravado, was visibly shaken. "It's not just a creature, it's a curse," he whispered, his voice quavering. In that final, heart-pounding confrontation, the boundaries between myth and reality dissolved. The creature lunged once more, and in the ensuing struggle, we fought with everything we had. I remember the weight of a heavy branch in my hands, the rush of adrenaline, and the surreal terror of facing something that belonged to a world beyond our understanding. Lila's voice, barely audible over the din of the storm, urged us on as if channeling the protective spirits of the ancient land. The battle was fierce and desperate. In a critical moment, as the skinwalker's claws nearly found purchase on my shoulder, I managed to land a decisive blow, knocking the creature back. Its scream, an unholy bone-chilling sound that echoed off the canyon walls, seemed to signal a temporary retreat. For what felt like an eternity, the storm raged on, and then, as if the anger of the ancient curse had been momentarily abated, the creature melted back into the darkness. In the eerie silence that followed, the gravity of our ordeal sank in. Mary was gone, a casualty of a force far beyond our reckoning. Carlos and Lila, though battered and traumatized, clung to each other for support. We returned to the RV, our refuge turned tomb, and sat in a heavy silence as the storm finally began to subside. The following day, in the fragile light of dawn, we emerged from our temporary sanctuary to assess the damage. The red rocks of Oak Creek Canyon looked as beautiful as ever, yet they now bore the scars of our encounter, deep gouges and eerie symbols that seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. I knew that the memories of that night would haunt me forever, and that the ancient curse we had inadvertently disturbed would not easily be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, I found myself grappling with the weight of loss and the fragility of human existence. The RV trip, which had begun as an escape from urban life, had become a descent into a primordial nightmare, a confrontation with an ancient evil that defied logic and reason. I still hear the echoes of that banshee-like wail on stormy nights, and in the quiet moments, I can almost see Mary's gentle smile, a bittersweet reminder of what we lost. Carlos eventually left town, unable to reconcile his thrill-seeking nature with the grim reality of our experience. Lila, her intuitive connection to the land forever altered, withdrew into herself, her journal now filled with frantic, cryptic entries. As for me, I have dedicated myself to understanding the old legends, hoping that by unraveling the mysteries of Oak Creek Canyon, I might find some measure of peace and perhaps redemption. I share this account not as a boast of survival, but as a solemn warning. The wilderness holds secrets older than any of us, and there are forces in this world that should never be trifled with. The skinwalker we encountered was not a mere phantom. It was a living embodiment of a curse, a predator lurking in the shadows of ancient lore. Its presence was a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that sometimes, in the quiet of a desolate canyon, the echoes of old terrors can rise again to claim what is theirs. Now, whenever I find myself alone with my thoughts, I can still hear that static-laced whisper from the ruined radio, feel the cold chill of the night when the creature came for us. And though I continue to live, every step I take is shadowed by the memory of that fateful night in Oak Creek Canyon, a night when the boundaries between myth and reality blurred, and the ancient curse of the land reached out with claws of darkness. This is my truth, a story of survival in the face of an unfathomable terror, a stark reminder that sometimes nature's beauty hides secrets too dreadful for mortal minds. And while I still search for answers in the silent expanse of the desert, I do so with a cautious heart, forever wary of the shadows that linger just beyond the edge of the firelight.